Hello, and come in quietly. This is Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, where curiosity pulls up a chair and science, gentle, patient science, takes the long way home so your thoughts can loosen their grip and drift. Tonight, I'm not asking you to solve anything. I'm asking you to listen to a place that has been listening longer than any of us have been speaking. Our slow journey leads to a silhouette that feels as permanent as the stars above it. A shape so old that even time seems to pause at its edge, like it's deciding whether to enter. The Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises from the desert like a frozen wave of stone, serene, unmoved, while the wind, tireless and restless, circles it again and again, never finding purchase. You've seen it in photographs, of course. You've watched it appear in documentaries and movies as if it were just another landmark, another monument. But if you've ever stared a second longer than the camera expected you to, you may have felt the question form on its own. How did they build it? And then, almost like a second whisper beneath the first, another question sometimes comes, less comfortable, less tidy, harder to set down again once you've picked it up. What if they didn't? What if the Egyptians we know from textbooks weren't the architects of this mountain of geometry, but its inheritors? What if the Great Pyramid wasn't born in the 4th dynasty, but adopted there, claimed, renamed, braided into a new story by a civilization that found it waiting? It's a strange thought, isn't it? The kind of thought people dismiss quickly because it makes the timeline wobble, because it asks too much of the imagination and too much of the historical record. And yet it returns. It returns the way certain melodies return when the room is quiet enough, uninvited, persistent, familiar. Before we go any farther, I want to ask you something soft and simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere dim, maybe, where the hum of evening is low and constant. Somewhere safe, where the day has already begun to release you. Wherever you are, imagine that the same moon you might see through your window is the same moon that watched over Giza, patient and unchanged, watching centuries like they were minutes. And if these slow wanderings soothe you, if you like drifting through old questions by the light of reason without needing the harsh overhead glare of certainty, then stay close. We don't hurry here. We don't yank mysteries into confession. We let them breathe. So take a slow breath with me. Let the noise of the day thin out. And let's begin, not with chisels or ropes or the clever mathematics of ramps, but with a question that has lingered for centuries because it refuses to be finished. What if the Egyptians were not the builders, but the heirs? The Great Pyramid, officially the Pyramid of Khufu, stands on the Giza Plateau near modern Cairo. It is the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, older than most written languages and so vast that even at its base, it feels less like architecture and more like landscape. According to conventional dating, it was constructed around 4,500 years ago during Egypt's 4th dynasty, supposedly as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu. Traditional archaeology tells a story of tens of thousands of laborers working for about 2 decades, using copper tools, sleds, water, leverage, and brilliant organization. It's an extraordinary story, a human story, one that has shaped how the world imagines Egypt. Disciplined, divine, capable of turning ambition into stone. But there's something in the stones themselves that doesn't sit neatly inside that version of events. Something subtle, not a single glaring contradiction, but a collection of quiet misalignments that make the mind tilt its head. One of them is erosion. Geological studies of the Sphinx and nearby structures have suggested weathering patterns that look less like the abrasion of wind and sand and more like the rounded, softened signatures of heavy rainfall. Not the occasional drizzle, not the rare storm. Something sustained, something thick enough to carve and smooth. But rainfall of that magnitude hasn't touched Giza for thousands of years, long before Khufu ever ruled. Some geologists have argued that the Sphinx could be far older than its accepted date, possibly carved or recarved from something that already existed in an age when the plateau saw rain. And though the pyramid itself shows less direct water erosion, It stands on the same plateau, in the same shifting sands, beneath the same long-forgotten skies. If the Sphinx can be older than the dynasties, could the pyramid, quietly, stubbornly, have deeper roots than we've agreed to give it? There's an allure to that possibility that's hard to deny, because it opens the door to a larger, more unsettling question. If the Egyptians didn't build the Great Pyramid, then who did? And why? The idea hovers between archaeology and dream. It suggests not just that a monument is misunderstood, but that history itself may suffer from a kind of amnesia about its own beginnings. It's comforting to picture history as a straight line, one invention leading neatly to the next, each civilization handing the next a clean bundle of knowledge. But what if it isn't a line at all? What if history is a circle or a spiral, rising and falling, repeating patterns with different faces, carrying fragments forward while other pieces vanish into the sand? The stones don't answer easily. They don't argue. They simply exist. Weight and silence arranged with frightening confidence. Each block of the Great Pyramid weighs, on average, over 2 tons. Some stones weigh as much as 15. There are more than 2 million blocks, fitted together with a precision that still makes modern engineers uneasy. The joints between many blocks are so tight you can't slip a credit card through them. The sides align to true north with astonishing accuracy, achieved without compasses, without satellites, without the modern instruments we lean on as if they are extensions of our own perception. And it isn't only the alignment. The base is almost perfectly level despite uneven bedrock. The internal passageways and chambers are arranged with mathematical precision, as though designed by someone fluent not only in engineering, but in geometry, astronomy, and perhaps even acoustics. To imagine all of this, achieved with copper chisels and wooden sleds, stretches the imagination. Not because the ancient Egyptians lacked brilliance, but because the scale of this particular brilliance feels like it belongs to an age of knowledge we can't quite trace. When you stand before the pyramid, you're looking at something that feels both human and inhuman, as if built by people like us, and yet with a patience and mastery so disciplined it feels almost alien, not extraterrestrial, not magical, just beyond what we can easily explain within the neat borders of the story we tell. For centuries, explorers, scholars, and mystics have been pulled toward this quiet contradiction. Napoleon stood before it and wept. Herodotus wrote with awe and confusion. Even now, scientists scan its depths with muons, cosmic particles slipping through stone, searching for hidden voids and chambers. And in the same breath, spiritual seekers speak of resonances, energies, harmonics, as if the pyramid were not only an object but an instrument. Somewhere between the measurable and the mysterious, it sits in silence, giving nothing away. And then, there is the emptiness. If the Egyptians inherited it, they did so with remarkable restraint. The hieroglyphs and inscriptions we associate with Egypt's monumental spaces are conspicuously absent from the Great Pyramid's interior. Unlike later tombs, it contains no elaborate carvings, no murals, no scenes of afterlife journeys, no loud declarations of divine authority. It is bare, almost clinical in its simplicity, stripped of the art where we would expect ego to bloom. That quiet emptiness has always been strange to archaeologists. Tombs were meant to be spoken spaces, echoing with prayers and offerings, packed with stories meant to survive the death of the body. The Great Pyramid, by contrast, feels like a riddle whispered to itself, uninterested in persuading anyone. Some have suggested the Egyptians found it already ancient, repurposed it for Khufu's name, and left their own marks elsewhere. If that's true, then the pyramid might not only predate Egyptian civilization, it might be a surviving fragment of a world that vanished so completely that only stone remained. Civilizations rise and fall all the time. We know this intellectually, but we rarely allow ourselves to imagine a civilization vanishing so thoroughly that the only thing left behind is a single monument too heavy for time to swallow. Yet the possibility is there, haunting and plausible in the way the desert itself is plausible. Empty on the surface, crowded underneath with what it has decided to keep. If a culture flourished before the flood myths that appear in nearly every ancient tradition, it might have been lost not by conquest or slow decay, but by cataclysm, climate change, violent shifts, the kind of reshaping the earth performs without malice and without apology. The Sahara, after all, wasn't always desert. Thousands of years ago, it was green, alive with lakes and rivers. Evidence of prehistoric settlements, fish fossils, and ancient rainfall patterns show that what is now barren sand was once fertile. Perhaps people thrived there long before recorded history. Perhaps they built and measured and mapped the stars, and perhaps when the world changed, when the rains stopped and the sands advanced, they left behind what they could not carry. The pyramid, in that light, becomes less a monument and more a message, a structure too immense to be forgotten even when its language is lost. When archaeologists study Egypt's early dynastic period, they find a sudden leap in sophistication. The shift from primitive settlements to monumental stone architecture happens so abruptly it can feel imported. How does a society move from simple mud brick structures to cutting, transporting, and fitting multi-ton limestone blocks with near microscopic precision in a handful of generations? Usually knowledge leaves a trail, experiments, gradual refinements, visible steps between the impossible and the achieved. In Egypt, those steps can look strangely compressed, as though the blueprint arrived from somewhere else, as though someone handed them not only a dream, but a template. It's tempting to think of inheritance here, not as property, but as legacy. Imagine an ancient people arriving at the plateau, a place already sacred in their myths. They find a structure, massive, inert, commanding. To them, it isn't alien, it is divine. They name it, revere it, weave it into their new world. The pyramid becomes theirs not by creation, but by recognition. In that moment, history resets itself. The builders are forgotten. The inheritors become the remembered. And the story begins again under new sunlight. Even the pyramid's alignment feels like an echo of memory older than Egypt. Its orientation to the cardinal directions and its possible connection to Orion have inspired countless theories. Some argue that the layout of the three pyramids at Giza mirrors the stars of Orion's belt, suggesting a celestial purpose beyond any ordinary funerary use. Star alignments drift over millennia due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. So if the alignment was ever perfect, it could point to a date thousands of years before Khufu. Orthodox Egyptology resists such revisions, partly because rewriting one timeline unanchors everything else that depends on it. But the data remains, and the questions remain. The Great Pyramid is not an outlier. It is a paradox. Every time it is studied, it seems both more understandable and more mysterious. It fits in history, but only barely. It feels both modern and prehistoric, a bridge between worlds that shouldn't have met. And standing there, you might picture a worker lifting his gaze from the stone, watching the sun fall toward the Nile, gold over water, dust in the air. Was he carving history, or merely preserving it? Maybe he didn't know. Maybe none of them did. Because building something you don't fully understand is not uncommon. We do it all the time. We inherit technologies, languages, systems. We add to them, reshape them, and eventually call them ours. It could be that the ancient Egyptians did the same, not with code or circuitry, but with stone. They took what they found and built around it a civilization that endured for millennia. Even if they inherited the pyramid, they gave it a new story, one that turned stone into myth, myth into identity. And in that sense, the Egyptians did build it. If not from scratch, then in spirit. They built its meaning. They turned an inexplicable artifact into the cornerstone of their relationship with eternity. Maybe that's the truest inheritance of all, the ability to find meaning in what was left behind. As night settles over the desert, the temperature drops sharply, the air cools, The sand quiets. The stars appear. Those same constellations that watch the pyramid's first sunrise. Somewhere out there, the Nile glints faintly, winding through the landscape like a thread of silver. Everything seems still, but nothing is truly still. The desert moves grain by grain, time moves thought by thought, and the pyramid remains, balancing between past and present, asking nothing, answering nothing, simply holding the question. You might close your eyes and imagine what the first Egyptians saw when they arrived here long before cities and empires. A shape too precise to be natural, too silent to be alive, too enduring to ignore. Maybe they approached it cautiously, unsure whether it was sacred or dangerous. Maybe they listened for voices inside the stone. Maybe they decided it was the work of gods because anything that survives so long without explanation must be divine. And maybe in naming it, in claiming it, they began the story that carried Egypt through thousands of years. Whether they built the pyramid or found it, it became part of who they were. Calendar, compass, metaphor, mystery all at once. And perhaps that's what matters most. Not who built it, but how it keeps building meaning even now. We stand before it millennia later and still ask the same questions. Still wonder at the same stones. Still feel the same mixture of awe and confusion. That unbroken chain of curiosity may be the real inheritance. And as we move quietly from this thought to the next, imagine the wind over Giza carrying faint echoes. Human voices, distant and indistinct, saying what humans have always said when faced with something greater than themselves. How did they do this? Why did they do this? Who came before us? The desert doesn't answer, but it listens. And in that listening, our next thought begins to form about the mystery still buried beneath the sand, waiting for history to remember. If you stand on the Giza Plateau in the hush of early morning, before the crowds, before the heat starts climbing the air like a slow fever, you can almost sense it. Not a sound, not exactly. More like a presence, a faint pressure in the silence. The desert seems to breathe in long, patient pulls, and the wind moves through sand the way a hand moves through hair, leaving patterns that vanish as soon as they're made. Beneath your feet are layers of limestone and sediment laid down in ages that never learned our names. And somewhere inside those layers, the earth keeps its secrets the way it keeps its bones. Without announcement, without apology, simply held in the dark until someone arrives with enough patience to listen. The Great Pyramid stands near the edge of it all like a sentinel looking past time, but the ground around it holds its own record. When modern excavators first came here with their maps and expectations, they dreamed of treasure, gold, sealed chambers, inscriptions that would explain everything in clean lines. What they found, again and again, was emptiness. Not total emptiness. There were scattered tools, bones, pottery shards, fragments of daily life. But not enough of the right kind. Not enough to make the story feel complete. A monument this large should have left a loud wake. Debris, experiments, mistakes, discarded tools in the thousands. The kind of clutter that follows any great project. And yes, there were workers' villages nearby, practical, real, humble in their mud brick geometry, storage pits and bread ovens, signs of organized labor. But even those settlements can feel strangely simple beside the monument they're said to support, like a small camp pitched beside a mountain that was already there. Sometimes it feels as though the pyramid arrived first, and civilization arranged itself around it afterward, like planets organizing their paths around a silent sun. The desert has always hidden and revealed in its own time. Nothing truly disappears here. It only sinks. Sand covers, protects, forgets for a while, then shifts and returns a piece of the past like an absent-minded gift, a shard of pottery, a tomb entrance, a statue whose face has been worn smooth by centuries of moving air. Archaeologists learn to respect this rhythm, but at Giza, the rhythm feels different. There's a sense of waiting, as though the plateau knows it is holding more than it has shown. Under the dunes are layers of construction, ancient walls, causeways, corridors, and tunnels that don't all belong to a single period. They overlap like palimpsests, one civilization reusing the bones of another. Each new excavation is less like finding a neat chapter and more like discovering a book that has been written over many times, older ink still faintly visible beneath the newer. One of the most persistent whispers from beneath the sand does not come from pottery or inscriptions, but from the ground itself. Geophysical surveys, radar, seismic studies, electrical resistivity have detected anomalies beneath parts of the Giza Plateau, including areas around the Sphinx. Cavities, voids, shapes that don't match natural formations. Some have been partially investigated. Others remain sealed, waiting for methods careful enough to study them without tearing the page as we turn it. What are these spaces? Storage rooms, natural fissures, structural relief chambers, or something else? Remnants of an older construction phase, older even than what we call ancient Egypt. The instruments don't answer. They only hint. But those hints align, unsettlingly, with what certain old stories have insisted for a very long time. Long before modern archaeology gave the plateau its official dates, local traditions carried a different kind of timeline. Medieval Arab historians such as al-Makrizi and Ibn Washia recorded accounts, some drawn from earlier sources, some from oral memory, that the pyramids were built not by pharaohs but by a mysterious people before a great flood. A civilization of knowledge, they said, wiped away when the world changed. In their telling, the pyramids were not tombs, but repositories. Vaults of science and star lore built to preserve wisdom before catastrophe arrived. Modern scholarship tends to classify these as myths, poetic inventions, embellished through retelling, shaped by religious imagination and the human habit of making the past more dramatic than it was. And yet myths are rarely made from nothing. They're often fossils, truth compressed by time, reshaped by fear and wonder, until the original form is difficult to see. Even the oldest Egyptian sacred texts, like the pyramid texts of Saqqara, speak of eras before kings, before names, when the gods walked the earth. In those verses, the boundary between deity and ancestor blurs. The first builders are described not as ordinary mortals, but as beings closer to the divine, architects of harmony between heaven and land. It is easy, and often correct, to read this symbolically. But what if the symbol is also memory? What if gods in such texts are the dim cultural recollection of earlier people, humans whose skills seemed godlike to those who followed? A civilization does not need lasers or spaceships to look divine to a later age. It only needs knowledge that has been lost. When geologists study the bedrock near Giza, they find signs of quarrying and cutting that do not always sit comfortably inside the known timeline. Some cuts appear inconsistent with what copper implements would easily accomplish. Tool marks vary. Some surfaces are smoother than expected, as if shaped by a technique more controlled than pounding and chiseling. To the untrained eye, these details are easy to dismiss. Stone is complicated. Weather and time can soften edges. Human error can create irregularities. But to the trained eye, such inconsistencies become quiet questions about continuity. If later Egyptians quarried stone where earlier hands had already cut, then they may have inherited not only a site, but an infrastructure, a plateau already altered by forgotten labor. And then the erosion returns to the conversation, refusing to be excused. The Sphinx enclosure walls show rounded, undulating weathering, signatures that many argue are best explained by heavy rainfall, not wind-driven sand. The last period when that region experienced sustained, significant rain was near the end of the last ice age, somewhere around 10,000 BCE, far older than the conventional dating for the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. It isn't definitive proof. It is an argument written in stone that can be read more than one way. Critics point to groundwater, microclimates, salt exfoliation, and the complex behavior of limestone in desert conditions. The debate continues, respectful but persistent, like wind moving through corridors. But regardless of which explanation ultimately holds, the deeper truth remains. Our understanding of history is not fixed. It is rewritten whenever the earth chooses to reveal something it had been holding. Sometimes, when scientists scan beneath the pyramid with radar or muon detection, they find voids so precise they seem intentional, Space is carved as if designed to hold something. Perhaps structural, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps nothing at all. The unsettling part is that nothing at all can still be purposeful. Architects sometimes build emptiness on purpose, to relieve weight, to shape sound, to guide heat and airflow, to conceal what matters, or to leave room for future curiosity. The thought is humbling. The deeper we dig, the further back the trail seems to lead, until it dissolves into mystery. The desert silence is not empty. It is full of time. Every grain of sand crossing the plateau has been moved by centuries of wind warmed by countless suns. That movement is slow, but it is relentless, and it edits the surface of the world the way a hand edits a page, smoothing, erasing, rewriting. When 19th century explorers documented Giza in earnest, many recorded not only measurements, but sensations. The feeling that the place was awake, that it watched back. Some dismissed this as fatigue, heat, and imagination. Others spoke more poetically, wondering whether land could hold memory. If stones could dream, they said, the pyramids would be their thoughts. There is a reason so many cultures place lost knowledge beneath sand or soil. In the world's oldest stories, wisdom is often buried. Scrolls sealed in caves, temples hidden under dunes, cities swallowed by earth. We imagine the past doesn't simply fade, it sinks. And in Egypt, where the desert acts as both destroyer and preserver, that idea feels almost tangible. Archaeologists working around Giza have uncovered older layers beneath newer layers, each representing a chapter of settlement and change. Who is to say how many more chapters lie below the reach of current methods? Waiting. The plateau may be a stack of civilizations, each one building on the bones of the last, without fully understanding what it inherited. Some researchers propose Giza was chosen not merely for elevation or proximity to the Nile, but because something was already here. Markers, foundations, remnants of earlier sacred geometry. If the land itself carried older significance, then the Egyptians may have built atop it deliberately, aligning their own monuments with structures they believed divine. This could explain why Giza's layout seems to follow celestial patterns that some argue predate recorded Egyptian astronomy. Not because Egypt invented them fully formed, but because Egypt continued them. Legends from neighboring regions echo similar themes. Sumerian tradition speaks of ancient builders, Anunnaki, raising cities before a flood. Greek writers reported Egyptian priests claiming their civilization stretched back tens of thousands of years. Maybe the priests were speaking symbolically, or maybe they were repeating an older memory, preserved inside temple stories long after the hard evidence had been buried. Oral tradition is elastic. It stretches across millennia, keeping impressions even as details evaporate. The challenge is that myth blurs fact and imagination until they are braided together. A legend might begin as event and end as allegory. But if even a fraction points to real catastrophes, migrations, rediscoveries, then the ground beneath the Great Pyramid may hold traces of civilizations that survived in story, though not in artifact. The desert, indifferent as it seems, has been the stage for vanishings countless times. Entire towns have been swallowed by dunes in less than a century. Given thousands of years, what might it erase? And what might it preserve? Sealed perfectly beneath sand and heat, waiting for the right century to uncover it. When night falls, the air cools again, and the stillness deepens. Beneath that stillness, micro-tremors move through the crust, tiny vibrations carrying information across miles of stone. Geologists can read these like music. Ancient river channels, shifts in groundwater, the slow grind of tectonic plates. The earth is not dead. It remembers, just not in words. Sometimes I think about what it must have felt like for the first modern hands that brushed sand off a limestone block that hadn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. To touch a surface last touched by a vanished life. Archaeology collapses time that way. A small object, a tool, a footprint, can make millennia disappear in an instant. You feel the past breathe again, faintly, through dust. Then the desert closes itself once more, patient as ever. If the Egyptians inherited the Great Pyramid, then they inherited not only a monument, but the question attached to it. They might have stood where we stand now, hearing the same wind, watching the same stars, wondering who came before. Maybe they noticed older weathering on stones and felt uneasy about it. Maybe they found remnants beneath their own foundations and decided those remnants belonged to gods. Perhaps even then there were whispers in the sand telling them they were not the first and would not be the last. History might not always begin where we think it does. Sometimes it resumes. And as we drift forward with that thought, imagine the sands of Giza continuing their slow migration through centuries, covering, uncovering, rearranging the world grain by grain. The desert does not hurry. It trusts time the way stone trusts gravity. It knows everything buried will one day return to light. And so it waits, just as we do. The more you look at the Great Pyramid, the more it feels like it's holding something back. Not a secret chamber in the cinematic sense, not a trapdoor that swings open when the right torch is held to the wall, but a story, an older story, pressed so deep into the logic of the monument that it can't be read in ordinary sentences. The surface is familiar. Limestone, angles, shadows. But beneath the familiar is a kind of memory. The monument has watched too many ages to belong cleanly to just one of them. Sand may hide its lower stones, but something else hides its origin. If the Egyptians inherited it, then someone long before them must have shaped its first intent. Whoever they were, their fingerprints have faded. Their names have dissolved. Their language is gone. And yet their work remains, speechless, heavy, precise, like the warmth left in a room after a fire has gone out. These are the forgotten builders, not necessarily mythical, not necessarily global, not necessarily anything that fits into a single headline. Just earlier. Earlier than the story we like because it is orderly. Imagine the world as it might have been when those builders lived. The desert wasn't yet desert. The Nile's course may have wandered across greener ground, through wide valleys where herds grazed and trees reached toward a wetter sky. Rain fell more often then, shaping the limestone in soft, patient ways, carving shallow channels that would one day look like an argument in a geology paper. This was a different Egypt, a prehistoric landscape that smelled of damp earth and vegetation instead of dust and heat. People were there. We know that. Scattered communities, hunting, gathering, learning to use fire and shape stone. But among those communities perhaps were others, groups who knew how to do more than survive. People who watched the heavens with a kind of seriousness that turned observation into calculation. People who could measure, align, predict. People for whom the sky wasn't poetry but a clock, a map, a law. When archaeologists talk about the prehistoric Nile Valley, they often point out how abruptly great civilizations appear. Before the Old Kingdom, before the unification of Egypt, there are centuries of simpler life. Farming, fishing, trading along the river, and then, almost without warning, monumental architecture rises from the ground. Not a gentle incline of skill, but a leap. Some see that leap as the natural result of population, resources, and ambition finally meeting. Others feel a gap where foundations should be, a missing bridge between mudbrick and megalith. That gap may not be empty time. It may be buried time, erased by flood, by climate shift, by the slow forgetfulness that follows migration. Humanity has been building longer than our written records admit, and sometimes a single discovery cracks open the timeline like dry clay. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, is more than 11,000 years old, built before agriculture, before cities, before the wheel. Its stone pillars are carved with animals and symbols no one has deciphered. It was created by people who, according to older models of development, shouldn't have been able to organize that level of labor or artistry. Yet there it stands, indifferent to our models. If such builders existed there, it isn't unreasonable to wonder if others existed elsewhere, along the Nile, across North Africa, leaving behind structures later mistaken for sudden Egyptian genius. The forgotten builders may not have been a single lost empire. They could have been a thread running through humanity's earliest experiments with permanence, teaching by example rather than by textbooks, leaving behind stone when everything else, wood, fiber, spoken names, rotted away. What makes the Great Pyramid so striking in this conversation is how little it resembles the structures that are supposed to lead up to it. The Step Pyramid of Djoser is a marvel, transitional, layered, visibly experimental. You can see the evolution from mastabas, the rectangular tombs of earlier kings. It is brilliant and human and full of visible trying. And then with Khufu, we get something that looks like it arrived already perfected. A smooth-sided geometric mountain. No visible learning curve. No obvious trial stage at that scale. Just sudden mastery of engineering, alignment, and precision. The distance between Djoser's stepped experiment and Khufu's polished certainty is only a few generations. That is an implausibly short time for such an enormous leap, unless they weren't starting from nothing, unless they were remembering. When people hear the phrase, lost civilization, they often picture Atlantis, Lemuria, grand 19th century fantasies built to fill archaeological gaps with romance. But forgotten builders don't require a mythic continent. Civilizations don't have to sink beneath the ocean to disappear. They only have to lose continuity. A drought can empty a region. A flood can scatter a people. A disease can collapse a network of specialists in a single generation. Survivors remember fragments, not systems. Methods vanish even if outcomes remain. A tool survives without the manual. A structure survives without the story. And then descendants arrive, find what remains, and do what humans always do. They claim it, reinterpret it, build around it. They inherit stone and translate it into meaning. There are hints, subtle, not decisive, that Egyptian cosmology may contain the ghost of older memory. In their earliest creation myths, the world begins with a primeval mound rising from watery chaos. The Benben, the first land, the first stability. The pyramid's shape mirrors that mound perfectly. To the Egyptians, the pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a model of creation frozen in limestone, a recreation of the beginning of time. Was that symbolism invented to explain the pyramid, or was it inherited alongside it? Sometimes belief follows structure. Sometimes structure follows belief. The order is hard to untangle when you're standing thousands of years later with only fragments. Many of the world's oldest structures share an obsession with orientation. Solstices, equinoxes, cardinal directions, star risings. The Great Pyramid is among the most precise of them all. Its sides align almost perfectly to true north, deviating by only a fraction of a degree. Some internal shafts point toward specific stars as they appeared long ago. Stars that, depending on which hypothesis you favor, line up more cleanly in epochs older than Khufu. This has led some to suggest the knowledge used to design it may have been inherited, drawn from a longer tradition of skywatching that predates what we attribute to dynastic Egypt. Precession shifts the sky slowly over thousands of years, meaning a precise stellar alignment can act like a timestamp. If the pyramid's star connections are intentional, they could imply a design date earlier than the official story allows. Again, not proof, but a persistent whisper. And then there is the mathematics. Whoever designed the pyramid understood proportions in a way that feels almost timeless. The ratio of its perimeter to its height approximates pi. Its geometry echoes the golden ratio. Skeptics argue these relationships can arise naturally from simple design choices and that humans tend to find meaning after the fact. Believers argue the precision is too consistent to be coincidence. What we can say with confidence is this: the builders were not guessing. They were measuring. They were aiming at a kind of harmony that seems to mirror the cosmos itself. Whether that harmony was discovered by the Egyptians or inherited from earlier hands, it is real in the stone. The mystery of tools refuses to go away. Copper is soft, it wears quickly, it struggles against granite. Yet the pyramid's internal chambers contain massive granite blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, quarried from Aswan nearly 500 miles south. Transporting, shaping, and placing those stones with high precision is difficult even now. We can propose ramps, sledges, water lubrication, teams of laborers, clever engineering, and much of that may be true. But the logistics remain staggering. Some propose external ramps. Others propose internal spiral ramps. Some imagine counterweights. Some argue for methods now lost, not magical, simply unrecorded, belonging to a culture that didn't leave instruction manuals behind. The problem is not that solutions don't exist. The problem is that none feel complete enough to quiet the mind. Perhaps that is the haunting signature of forgotten builders. Their work remains, but their method evaporated, as if history kept the sculpture but erased the sculptor's hand. Still, even skeptical scholars admit early Egypt exhibits astonishing sophistication unusually early. Writing, administration, art, monumental building. Something accelerated development, rated. Whether that acceleration came from internal genius, external contact, or rediscovery of buried knowledge, the effect is similar. The civilization that rose along the Nile can look as though it began halfway through its own story. Some researchers suggest that before dynasties there may have been localized centers of specialized knowledge, small groups of surveyors, builders, astronomers, who did not build empires but built prototypes. When those groups vanished, their ideas remained as ruins, alignments, and myths, waiting for later peoples to stumble upon them. In that view, Egypt becomes less an isolated miracle, and more a revival. The next verse of a song that had been paused for a long time. The forgotten builders, if they existed, may not have been strangers from another world. They may have been humans at their own peak. People who understood stone, sky, and time with an intimacy we underestimate because we measure intelligence by what survives. But what survives is biased. Wood decays. Cloth dissolves. Writing burns. Only stone remains. If a civilization built mostly imperishable material and reserved stone only for its most sacred work, then we would remember it only through those sacred remnants. And perhaps that is exactly what we are seeing. The human story is not strictly linear. It is full of rises and falls. Knowledge can vanish in a single generation if it is not transmitted. Languages die. Skills fade. Even now, in our own era, we lose crafts within decades when industries shift. Stretch that process over thousands of years. Add floods, wars, migrations, and climate change. And you begin to see how a sophisticated past could become a mythic rumor. When modern engineers analyze the Great Pyramid, they often speak in terms of efficiency. The design distributes weight flawlessly. It resists earthquakes. It minimizes error. It is not only beautiful, it is durable. In a way, it resembles knowledge itself, simple from a distance, intricate up close, nearly indestructible if encoded in the right medium. Whoever built it understood something about permanence. They built not for a single king or a single era, but for time itself. They must have recognized that civilizations come and go, and that the only way to speak to the future is to build with materials the future cannot easily destroy. Maybe that's why we still listen so hard for their voices. We search for them in quarry marks and tool grooves, in alignments that point to constellations, in mathematical relationships that echo nature. We want to believe the stones are trying to tell us something, and maybe they are, just not in words. As night deepens over the plateau, the stars return, scattered across the sky like ancient dust. Orion rises and the belt shines with the same quiet confidence it carried when our ancestors named it. Below, the pyramid's dark outline mirrors the sky's geometry in a way that feels too neat to be accidental, even if it is. The air cools. The sand settles. The monument casts a long shadow toward the river that once fed empires. The forgotten builders remain unnamed, but their presence is everywhere, in every angle, every tight joint, every corridor that feels designed rather than carved. We may never find their graves. We may never recover their tools or understand their full intent. But we can sense them in the discipline of the structure, in its refusal to degrade into randomness, in the way it seems to hold a principle rather than a personality. They were here. We know it because stones remember what names cannot. And as the wind drifts over Giza, carrying grains of sand that have traveled across centuries, it is hard not to wonder whether the next gust will uncover something new. A trace, a clue, a forgotten line of thought preserved in bedrock, waiting for the moment history is ready to widen its memory. When you follow the Nile far enough in your mind, the river stops being a place and becomes a timeline. It is Egypt's pulse, winding through sand and cities in the long quiet of centuries, repeating itself the way breath repeats. It gave life to the land, and the land, grateful and watchful, gave meaning to time. Every flood, every retreat of water became a measure, a heartbeat. But what if the Nile once flowed under a sky that would feel unfamiliar to us? Not because the stars were different, but because their positions were. Not the small shift you notice over a season, but the slow, almost imperceptible drift that rewrites the heavens over millennia. If the Great Pyramid was built or rebuilt by inheritors, then its first designers may have lived beneath that older sky, in a world where the Sahara was not yet the ocean of sand we picture, but a living region scattered with lakes, rivers, and open savanna. Scientists call this time the African humid period. Deep into what is now barren wilderness, monsoon rains reached and lingered. The land held water. The land held life. Then, slowly at first, and then with alarming speed, the climate shifted. The rains retreated. Lakes evaporated. Vegetation thinned. The green world folded inward toward the last reliable artery, the Nile. That humid period ended roughly 5,000 years ago, around the same time dynastic Egypt began to bloom. One world was closing as another was opening. Under that earlier climate, the Nile's rhythm would have been different. Its floods were still fed by distant highlands, but regional rains would have shaped the broader landscape, carving channels, filling basins, making migration easier across what would later become impassable desert. People who lived then, before pharaohs, before temples, before a unified Egypt, would have understood water as both resource and map. They would have followed it, worshipped it, feared it, watched it closely enough that observation became tradition, and at night, they would have watched the sky. The stars themselves do not change quickly, but the Earth does something subtle and relentless. It wobbles. The planet's axis traces a slow circle over about 26,000 years, a motion called precession. It is so gradual that a single human lifetime barely notices, but over centuries it alters the position of constellations relative to the horizon. Pole stars change, alignments drift. A sacred direction slowly becomes less accurate until it is no longer sacred, or until someone recalibrates the belief. If the Great Pyramid's design is truly tied to stars, if its alignments are not decorative but intentional, then precession becomes a kind of clock embedded in stone. Some researchers have traced the pyramid's supposed relationship to Orion's belt to a time far earlier than Khufu, around 10,500 BCE. That date echoes in certain theories because it roughly coincides with the end of the last ice age, a period of dramatic planetary change. Is it coincidence? Maybe. But it is a compelling one. Because if an alignment was perfect once, and if that perfection was the point, then the design could point backward, toward an era we do not normally allow monuments to inhabit. The Nile remembers, even when we don't. Core samples from riverbeds preserve layers of silt and clay, stacking year after year like quiet calendars. In those layers, scientists can see interruptions, periods when floods were weaker, when drought narrowed the river's generosity. Every drought would have forced migration. Every migration would have scattered knowledge like seeds. Something concentrated becomes diffuse. A tradition once held by specialists becomes folklore. A calculation becomes a story. A measurement becomes a myth. This is how civilizations can inherit brilliance without understanding its source. When we talk about Egypt, we often imagine its landscape as eternal, the Nile, the desert, the plateau. But Egypt has shifted. The floodplain has moved, the delta has expanded, branches of the river have dried up. Some archaeologists suggest that in the past, the Nile's course may have run closer to Giza than it does today, making transport of heavy stones easier. If true, it strengthens practical construction narratives. But it also suggests something else. The plateau's relationship to water may have been more intimate in earlier ages, when climate and geography were not yet fixed into the forms we know. And if the land was chosen for more than convenience, chosen for alignment, then proximity to the river would matter not just for transportation, but for symbolism. Because in Egyptian thought, the sky and the earth were twins. The goddess Nut arched overhead, her body the firmament. The god Geb lay beneath, the land itself. Between them moved the Nile, a living thread. The stars were not distant objects, they were beings, ancestors, markers of order. The Milky Way, shimmering in the darkness, could be imagined as a celestial river mirrored by the one on Earth. Some traditions suggest the Nile was seen as the earthly reflection of that starry band, a terrestrial echo of the heavens. If that worldview feels poetic, remember, poetry is often how knowledge survives when technical language is lost. If earlier people, pre-dynastic, perhaps even pre-agricultural, had mapped the sky carefully enough, they might have understood that heaven and earth were linked by cycles: flood and constellation, solstice and harvest, star rising and river swelling. Those connections are not mystical. They are observational. They are science wearing the clothing of story. As the Sahara dried, people migrated toward the Nile's corridor, compressing into a narrower world. Along with them came rituals, symbols, remembered alignments. They carried pieces of an older sky in their minds. The new civilization that rose along the river may have been, in part, a mosaic of older cultures pushed together by climate, a convergence, a condensation. And in that convergence, old knowledge can become suddenly visible as if it appeared from nowhere. This is where the Great Pyramid star associations become more than a curiosity. The idea that the three main pyramids of Giza correspond to Orion's belt persists because the match is not vague. The smallest pyramid is slightly offset, much like the smallest belt star is offset. The distances and angles echo each other with an accuracy that makes coincidence feel a little too easy. To archaeoastronomers, this suggests intent. To skeptics, it suggests pattern hunting. To me, echoes of the forgotten earth, it suggests something quieter. That humans, again and again, try to anchor themselves by mirroring the sky. If the sky is stable, we feel less afraid of the ground shifting beneath us. Now imagine a time when the ground did shift, when coastlines drowned, when climates flipped, when rains that once fed the Sahara retreated. In such an age, looking upward for a map would have been more than wonder. It would have been survival. The sky would have been the only thing that still felt consistent when the earth was changing. If the Great Pyramid's design is older in concept than in name, then perhaps it was built as a kind of anchor against a world in transition, geometry as stability, alignment as reassurance, a statement in stone that the cosmos still has order, even when the climate does not. Knowledge can outlive understanding. A pattern can be preserved even after its original reason fades. You can imagine an architect centuries later standing on the plateau with inherited measurements, aligning stone to a design passed down through generations. He might not know why Orion mattered. He might only know that it did, that the ancestors insisted it did, that the pattern was sacred. In that sense, even Khufu's builders, if they were the primary builders, could still have been inheritors of an older plan. The Nile at night would have reinforced this inheritance endlessly. Picture the river's surface dark and moving, reflecting stars and trembling lines. In the right season, when floodwaters widened the river and smoothed its surface, the reflections could become startlingly clear. The Milky Way above and its ghost below. The heavens doubled. A person standing at the bank might feel as though the world had two skins, one of water and land, one of light. To stand at Giza in those conditions, with pyramids dark against the horizon, stars bright above, the river glimmering, would have felt like standing at an intersection. Not merely between land and sky, but between life and death, present and past, human and cosmic. It is no wonder Egypt imagined death not as an ending, but as a journey. The architecture itself invites the idea of passage. And if the earliest purpose of the pyramid was not funerary, but cosmological, if it was meant to model the universe, to encode cycles, to serve as a kind of instrument for alignment, then later use as a tomb could have been a repurposing. A new meaning layered over an older function. The structure remains. The story shifts. Even in our time, the geometry of Giza reveals itself in light. At certain times of year, the sun sets between pyramids in ways that feel staged. Shadows slice across stone like precise blades. The place tells time. It marks cycles. It behaves like a calendar that does not need paper. The more we study Egypt, the more it becomes clear that their monuments were often acts of remembering. Their civilization was obsessed with continuity, with preserving names and rituals so that nothing truly died. But that obsession could itself be inherited from ancestors who watched an older world vanish. To inherit a desert that was once green is to learn deeply that time changes everything. To build something that resists that change is to defy forgetting. The Nile's earlier sky may be gone, but its reflection can be imagined still, etched into stone by hands that believed alignment mattered. Whether those hands belong to dynastic Egyptians or to forgotten builders before them, the act is the same: to measure change, to capture order, to connect earth to heaven so the human mind can rest inside something larger than itself. If the Nile could speak, it might tell us that Egypt is not a beginning, but a continuation. It might describe people who watched the same stars, mapped the same cycles, and left behind markers we mistake for origins. It might whisper of constellations rising in slightly different positions, of a pole star not yet named, of a sky that felt older. Some nights, if you stand by water long enough, any water, even a small river far from Egypt, you can almost sense how ancient that impulse is. The world reflected above and below, and the mind trying to connect the two. And so when we look at the Great Pyramid and its orientation, we are not only seeing architecture, we are seeing memory, a preserved relationship between sky, land, and time. A kind of message that does not require language. The builders, whoever they were, did not only measure stone, they measured motion. They measured the slow drift of stars, the cycle of light, the rhythm of flood. They measured the dialogue between what changes and what endures. And as that thought settles like dust in still air, another begins to rise. If the Egyptians inherited such a monument, then they inherited more than stone and alignment. They inherited mystery itself. And human beings do not live comfortably beside mystery for long without turning it into meaning. That is where the next part of our journey leads, into the way inheritors transform what they find into gods, myths, and identity, turning an old structure into the foundation of a civilization. If the Egyptians truly inherited the Great Pyramid, then what they inherited wasn't just stone. They inherited an unanswered question. They inherited silence shaped into geometry. They inherited a structure so vast and so indifferent to ordinary human life that it could not simply stand there without stirring the mind into explanation. And when people encounter something that outlasts their understanding, they do what humans have always done. They give it meaning. They braid it into story. They turn it into a mirror for the divine. In a sense, this is where Egypt, as we recognize it, begins. Not necessarily in the first cut of limestone, but in the first act of interpretation. Because building is only one kind of creation, the other is naming. The other is deciding what something is. Imagine arriving in a landscape that feels ancient even when your own history is young. The river is familiar, the sky is familiar, but the monument in front of you does not feel like the work of recent hands. It feels like a remnant, like the bones of an older world standing upright. Early Egyptians may have looked at the Great Pyramid not as architecture but as proof. Proof that something beyond ordinary life had touched this ground. To them, perfection was not human. Precision was not human. Endurance was not human. So the pyramid became divine not because someone declared it so, but because it felt divine. The Egyptians were masters of weaving the sacred into the everyday. Their gods were not distant. They were in the rising of the sun, the swelling of the river, the growth of grain, the turning of stars. Every cycle had a name. Every force in nature wore a face. This was not superstition in the shallow sense. It was a system of attention, a way of living in the world without separating the physical from the meaningful. The pharaoh, too, belonged to that system. He was divine not because he was personally exceptional, but because his role was cosmic. He was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the balance, the order, the rightness of the world. If Ma'at failed, chaos returned. Drought, famine, invasion, collapse. The king's duty was not only political, it was metaphysical. Now imagine inheriting a structure like the Great Pyramid, one that already embodies balance with terrifying precision. Its level base, its orientation, its geometry, its stillness beneath stars. To inherit such a thing would be to inherit a message that the world is ordered, that heaven and earth can be aligned, that stability can be engineered, that chaos can be resisted if you build correctly, think correctly, live correctly. The pyramid would not merely support religion, it would author it. And so, rather than dismantling the monument, rather than ignoring it, the Egyptians would have done what they did best. They would have integrated it. They would have translated stone into theology. The ascending passages could become the soul's climb. The starward shafts could become paths for the spirit. The sealed chambers could become the hidden heart of eternity. The very emptiness inside, so strange to modern expectations of tomb decoration, could become a sacred absence, a deliberate silence, an inner space too holy for ordinary imagery. Because sometimes what is not said carries more weight than what is. Unlike later royal tombs, the Great Pyramid's interior is strikingly undecorated. No colorful murals, no carved prayers blooming across the walls, no vivid maps of the afterlife. For archaeologists, this absence is awkward. It disrupts patterns. Tombs were meant to be loud with meaning, packed with spells and scenes and offerings. The Great Pyramid feels almost clinical. Bare stone, clean geometry, a silence that doesn't ask to be loved. And yet, to a culture obsessed with eternity, that bare silence could have been interpreted as purity. A space not for storytelling, but for alignment. Not for art, but for function. Not for the ego of a king, but for something older and larger than any individual. If the pyramid was inherited, perhaps the Egyptians sensed that it belonged to a different category of sacredness, one they didn't want to violate with their own imagery. So they left it mostly untouched. They placed a name on it. They built temples nearby. They raised causeways and subsidiary structures. They made the plateau speak Egyptian without forcing the pyramid itself to speak their language. They built around the inheritance like a family builds around an heirloom, adding context, adding ritual, adding meaning, while keeping the central object strangely pristine. This is how inheritance works. It transforms what it touches, but it also honors what it cannot fully remake. Over centuries, Egyptian theology grew into one of the most intricate systems the ancient world ever produced. Ra's daily journey across the sky, Osiris's death and restoration, Isis's devotion, Horus's kingship, the weighing of the heart, the field of reeds, the endless cycle of death as transformation rather than cessation. It is easy to think of these as invented myths, but myths often act like containers. They hold older knowledge when the original language has been lost. If the earliest builders of Giza, whoever they were, designed with a cosmic framework. Then later Egyptians could have inherited that framework as a set of sacred instincts. They might not have inherited the blueprints, but they inherited the shape of the thought, that the universe is lawful, cyclical, mirrored above and below. You can see this mirrored thinking everywhere in Egyptian art and architecture. Temples were not merely buildings, they were models of the universe. Columns like papyrus stalks, ceilings painted as star fields, sanctuaries arranged like the hidden core of creation. Every wall was both story and structure. Every proportion carried symbolic weight. Even if the Great Pyramid began as something different, instrument, marker, anchor, message, the Egyptians would have recognized it as the most powerful model of the cosmic order imaginable. A mound of stone that looked like the first land rising from the waters. An object that aligned with stars. A structure that behaved like a calendar of light and shadow. To them, it was not merely ancient, it was correct. And so, they shaped their civilization around the idea of correctness, mat, order, maintained through alignment with divine patterns. The pyramid, inherited or not, became the physical proof that such alignment was possible. The irony is gentle and sharp at the same time. The very act of forgetting the pyramid's original purpose may have given it immortality. If the Egyptians had understood it as merely a relic of an earlier culture, they might have left it to erode, respected but unattended. But by making it sacred, by building ritual around it, by tying kingship to it, they ensured it would be maintained, guarded, and remembered. The inheritors became preservers, and in preserving it, they became creators of a new layer of meaning so thick that it now feels original. You can see the strain of inheritance in the monuments that followed. Later pharaohs built more pyramids as though trying to echo the first, but the echoes weaken. The later pyramids are smaller, less precise, more prone to structural failure. Some collapsed. Some were built in ways that feel rushed, as if the builders were copying a form without fully mastering the method that made it stable. That pattern, declining quality after a sudden peak, appears in many cultural inheritances. It is what happens when a civilization receives a masterpiece from the past and tries to replicate it with partial understanding. The symbol survives. The technique erodes. And yet the Egyptians never abandoned the form. The pyramid became more than engineering. It became a sign, a sacred silhouette that could be carried forward even when the full ability to reproduce its perfection faded. Shapes can survive where methods cannot. This is another reason the Great Pyramid feels like an inheritance. It stands as the high point, the reference point, the object everyone else looks back to. Later works orbit it. They pay homage. They imitate. They reinterpret. That is the behavior of descendants in the presence of an ancestor. Even the concept of divine kingship may have been strengthened by this inherited geometry. The pharaoh was seen as the living Horus, the bridge between the gods and the people. But a bridge is also a structure, an alignment between realms. The pyramid itself is a bridge made of stone, base on earth, apex to sky, a continuous slope connecting the two. In that sense, the king's divinity becomes architectural. He is not divine because he claims it. He is divine because he embodies the same function as the monument: mediator, aligner, stabilizer. The pyramid teaches the culture what a king is supposed to be. And if the pyramid was older than the kings, then the kings may have built their identity on an inheritance without realizing it. This is how old structures shape new souls. When you walk through later Egyptian temples, you see walls covered with scenes of gods conferring authority upon rulers. You see ceilings painted as night skies. You see rituals carved into corridors in endless repetition, like incantations made physical. The whole civilization becomes a mechanism for continuity, for resisting the chaos that ends worlds. Perhaps that resistance was born from memory. Memory of a time when a world ended. If the ancestors of the Egyptians had lived through climate collapse, migrations, the drying of the Sahara, then stability would have become sacred. The need to anchor life to cycles would have become an obsession. And the Great Pyramid, whether inherited from forgotten builders or built as an early act of dynastic genius, would have been the perfect anchor, the perfect proof that order could be made permanent. But even as the Egyptians layered meaning onto the monument remained strangely aloof. It accepted their stories without revealing its own. It absorbed prayers without returning explanations. It let itself be called a tomb without providing the comforts of a tomb. It let itself be crowned with a king's name while holding onto a silence that feels older than any dynasty. There is something profoundly human in this dance between structure and story. When we inherit something we cannot fully explain, we do not discard it. We interpret it. We domesticate it with meaning. We make it ours through narrative. The Egyptians did this with extraordinary grace. They did not need to know the original purpose of the pyramid to make it central. They only needed to feel its gravity, to sense that it mattered, to recognize that a thing capable of surviving such time must belong to eternity itself. In doing so, they kept the forgotten builders alive, not as names, not as biographies, but as influence. The original hands may have vanished, but their work shaped what came after. It shaped gods, kings, rituals, architecture, and the Egyptian relationship with death and time. If the forgotten builders gave the world the structure, the Egyptians gave it a soul. And perhaps this is the most honest way to hold the mystery. Not as a battle between built and found, but as a layered reality. The pyramid could have been older in concept, older in foundation, older in sacredness, then adopted, refined, claimed, and re-centered by Egypt. A monument moving through eras like a stone carried by a river, collecting new meanings as it goes. As night deepens over Giza, the stars return, steady and indifferent. The Nile glimmers faintly in the distance, the old mirror of the sky. Somewhere between those two, river and stars, the pyramid stands, heavy with layered interpretation. In that layered silence, the next chapter of our quiet journey waits. The ones who came later, the modern seekers, the scientists and skeptics, the archaeologists and dreamers, all approaching the same stone with different tools, trying to peel back meaning without breaking it. Because inheritance does not end when a civilization ends. It continues through anyone who looks at the pyramid and feels the pull of the unanswered. It's strange how the oldest mysteries attract the newest minds. There's a quiet magnetism to questions that refuse to settle, especially when those questions sit in plain sight under a hard blue sky, surrounded by sand that looks empty until you remember how well emptiness can hide things. Every archaeologist who steps onto the Giza Plateau arrives with a certain kind of reverence, even if they would never use that word. They come with notebooks, scanners, grids, drones, and carefully practiced caution. They kneel beside stones once touched by hands that never imagined archaeology as a future profession. They work in the shadow of something that feels too large for any single explanation, and they inherit their own dilemma. Modern archaeology is built on evidence, on restraint, on the discipline of not claiming more than the data can carry. But the Great Pyramid is the kind of monument that tests that discipline. It offers measurements that are precise and satisfying, yet it withholds the one thing humans always crave most: intent. It tells you how it stands. It refuses to tell you why it exists. When early excavators entered the pyramid, they expected treasure. That expectation wasn't greed alone. It was logic. Royal tombs should hold bodies. They should hold offerings. They should hold the loud decorative language of an afterlife culture. But inside, the chambers were bare. Stone, air, echo. No gilded coffin. No murals. No grand inventory of eternity. At first, the emptiness was explained the simplest way: looting. Robbers came, stole the valuables, vanished. It's a reasonable assumption. Egypt was looted repeatedly over centuries, but the emptiness still feels strange even in that context. Robbers take what is portable. They do not remove architecture. They do not erase the entire character of a space. And the Great Pyramid's character feels less like a tomb that was emptied, and more like a structure that was never meant to be filled with the usual kind of funerary clutter in the first place. This is where the archaeologist's dilemma begins to sharpen. The data suggest function, but the function is unclear. The structure behaves like a riddle made of engineering. Over time, countless theories have been offered. Some cautious, some wild, some beautiful in the way a dream is beautiful. Calendar, observatory, temple, initiation chamber, mathematical model of Earth, power plant, granary. Each theory tries to explain the same stubborn facts: the precision, the alignment, the inner design, the silence. The problem is not that ideas are lacking, it's that proof is thin, and the pyramid sits calmly through it all, allowing speculation to swirl around it like sand in wind. In the 19th century, surveyors approached Giza with a new kind of devotion: measurement. Flinders Petrie, among others, mapped the pyramid with obsessive care. His results revealed a level of precision that startled even the most practical minds. The base lengths, the orientation to true north, the near-level foundation across a wide footprint, these details were not the rough work of an early civilization doing its best. They were the results of expertise. Petrie documented what he could, but documentation is not explanation. He could record the perfection without answering where it came from. That's the peculiar burden of modern study. Every new measurement makes the builders look more capable, and every increase in their apparent capability makes the absence of clear methods feel more troubling. In the 20th and 21st centuries, technology added new senses to the human body: ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, thermal imaging, Mune tomography, cosmic particles used like X-rays to map density and voids inside stone. And the pyramid responded the way it always does, by revealing enough to deepen the mystery. When Muon scans detected a large void above the Grand Gallery, headlines announced a hidden chamber. The discovery was real, the excitement was real, but the meaning remains elusive. Is it structural? An engineering space meant to relieve weight? Is it intentional? An unknown corridor, a sealed volume, a forgotten feature? The scan can outline emptiness, but it cannot label it. This is one of the hardest truths in archaeology. We can find shapes without finding purpose. We can map the body of history without always understanding the mind that moved it. Even among experts, opinions split. Conventional Egyptology holds that the pyramid was built during Khufu's reign, around 2550 BCE, by skilled laborers using simple tools and extraordinary organization. Alternative chronologies argue for older origins, pointing to geological questions around the Sphinx, astronomical alignments, and the strange suddenness of early Egyptian mastery. Between those poles is a broad and quiet middle. Scholars who acknowledge anomalies without jumping to conclusions, who recognize that the historical narrative is strong but not omniscient, and that the pyramid is not obligated to fit our tidy categories, because categories are modern. The past did not necessarily divide the world the way we do. We separate engineering from spirituality, science from ritual, architecture from myth. But the people who built or inherited monuments like this may have understood all these things as one braided system. To align stone to stars could be both a calculation and a prayer. To measure the cardinal directions could be both a survey and a sacred act. To build could be to worship without needing separate vocabulary. If that unity existed, then modern interpretation becomes difficult not because the ancients were incomprehensible, but because our frameworks are too segmented to translate theirs cleanly. This is the archaeologist's dilemma in its most honest form: the fear that we might be asking the wrong questions. Not, how did they haul stones, but what did hauling stones mean to them? Not, where is the treasure, but why did they choose emptiness? Not, what does this chamber store, but what does this geometry express? The Great Pyramid forces modern minds to confront the limits of certainty. It also forces a subtler humility, the recognition that a monument can be perfectly understood in terms of mechanics and still remain mysterious in terms of meaning. And there is another layer, quieter and more human. Many who work at Giza describe a sensation that is difficult to put into academic language. Not superstition, not ghost stories. Simply the feeling of being watched by time. You stand among stones that have seen empires rise and fall. You run a hand over a block cut before your language existed. You realize your own life is a brief flicker beside this mass of deliberate endurance. Archaeology is not only about the past, it's about connection. A brush removing dust from an ancient surface is a hand reaching through millennia. That contact can feel intimate, it can feel overwhelming, it can make the scholar silent for reasons that have nothing to do with methodology. Giza does that to people. Even the most skeptical sometimes grow quiet there, not because they believe in magic, but because the scale of human patience embedded in the stone feels almost unbearable. Modern archaeology also carries responsibility. Every interpretation becomes part of what future generations accept as truth. If you declare the pyramid fully explained, you risk burying questions that should remain alive. If you declare it impossible for its time, you risk turning careful study into spectacle. The balance is delicate. Wonder without evidence becomes fantasy. Evidence without wonder becomes sterile. The pyramid sits exactly between those extremes, challenging every researcher to hold both at once, to be precise and to be open, to be skeptical and to be honest about uncertainty, to understand that not knowing is not failure. Sometimes not knowing is the most accurate state. Even the tools of modern inquiry can only do so much. Drones can map the plateau in stunning detail, but they cannot reconstruct intent. Lasers can measure angles to fractions, but they cannot recover the silent cultural assumptions that guided those angles. We can reproduce ramps and levers in experiments, but we cannot fully reproduce the lived world of the builders, their social systems, their sense of sacredness, their relationship to time. And perhaps that is the core of the dilemma. The pyramid is not only a structure, it is a worldview made physical. You can measure a worldview's dimensions. You can't always translate its meaning. Some researchers suggest that we may never fully solve the pyramid because it was never meant to be solved in the way we solve modern puzzles. It may have been designed to be experienced, its proportions felt, its alignments witnessed, its inner spaces entered with ritual attention. The building might function as a kind of slow instruction for the mind, a lesson in stability, ascent, and alignment. In that reading, the emptiness is not absence. It is an invitation. And still, the work continues. Year after year, teams return. They map, scan, and publish. The picture becomes clearer in some ways. Workers' settlements, tool traces, logistics, quarry sites. Yet the deeper questions remain intact. The Great Pyramid endures as a dialogue partner that answers every hypothesis with silence. At night, when the equipment is packed away and the plateau grows still, the stars return. The same stars ancient surveyors once used for alignment now shine above modern surveyors aligning their grids and instruments. Time folds gently in on itself. Somewhere in the cool darkness, archaeologists sit in small circles comparing notes under electric light, unaware that they are part of the same continuity they study. They too are builders, of knowledge rather than stone. Their monuments are papers, maps, data sets. Their legacy is interpretation. And when dawn comes, the pyramid remains unchanged. It neither reveals nor conceals. It simply exists, letting each generation find itself reflected in its shadow. The archaeologist's dilemma, in the end, may not be a problem to solve, but a posture to adopt, to approach mystery as part of discovery, not as an obstacle to it, to understand that certainty is not always the most honest goal. Sometimes the most honest achievement is a clearer question. And as we drift from the modern tools back toward the ancient stone itself, another thread begins to rise, the quiet, tactile intimacy of craftsmanship. Because if meaning is difficult to recover, the physical language of stone still offers something we can almost feel, the echo of hands. That is where we go next. When you stand close enough to touch the Great Pyramid, the first surprise is not its size, it's its texture. The stone is cool even under sun, uneven in the way weather makes everything honest. And yet the overall pattern is unmistakably deliberate. You can trace seams with your eyes. Thin, precise boundaries where one block meets another, like the faint lines between years in a long life. It's impossible to put your hand on that limestone without thinking of the hands that put it there. Hands that carried tools. Hands that measured. Hands that learned the weight of stone the way the body learns a language, through repetition until meaning becomes muscle. Every angle is intent. Every joint is discipline. The pyramid is not merely a pile of rock. It is an arrangement of decisions, and decisions, when they endure this long, begin to feel like messages. Stone is a kind of memory. It forgets slowly. The marks left by tools can last longer than the names of the people who made them. When archaeologists study quarries, they search for those marks the way detectives search for fingerprints, cutting lines, wedge holes, grooves where a tool bit into the rock and slid away. Each trace is a gesture preserved. At Giza, many of these gestures make sense. Others are stranger. Some quarry marks appear in directions that don't neatly match standard explanations. Some surfaces look smoother than expected. Some joints are so tight they feel less assembled than grown, like crystalline structure rather than construction. This is where the story becomes intimate. This is where we stop talking about civilizations and start talking about craft. Imagine a quarryman at the limestone cliff near the plateau. The sun is relentless. The air tastes of dust and minerals. He holds a tool, copper, stone, dolerite, whatever it is, and he strikes with practiced rhythm. The sound is sharp. The vibration travels up his arm and into his shoulder. He knows by feel how deep the cut is, how the rock wants to split, how to persuade it without wasting strength. But he is not only cutting. He is following measurements laid out by others, surveyors who understand angle, line, level. The quarryman's labor is part of a chain of precision. He may never see the final form of the pyramid. He may only see blocks, ramps, ropes, sweat, shouted instructions, and the steady movement of stone across the plateau. Yet the work is coordinated. It is intentional. It belongs to an idea larger than any single person. And that idea, whatever its original purpose, demanded an obsession with exactness. We often imagine ancient building as brute force. Thousands of bodies dragging stone, pounding rock, improvising solutions. That image isn't entirely wrong. Labor is real. Bodies are real. But it can hide something important. Brute force cannot produce micrometer-level joins by accident. Brute force cannot align vast faces to cardinal directions with near-perfect accuracy by sheer determination. Precision requires more than strength. It requires a culture of measurement. It requires standards. It requires training. It requires patience that can be taught. The Great Pyramid's precision carries the feeling of a craft tradition, something refined over time, passed from hand to hand until it becomes instinct. That is why the idea of sudden invention feels odd, because mastery usually has a visible childhood, and the pyramid seems to have skipped it. Modern engineers marvel at the monument's efficiency, the way weight is distributed, the way stress is managed, the way the structure resists collapse and resists earthquakes. It is not only beautiful, it is stable in a way that looks effortless. And effortless is often the signature of deep expertise. But expertise is not the same as technology in the modern sense. It doesn't require machines. It requires understanding the world well enough to collaborate with it. The builders knew limestone the way a sailor knows water. They understood its fracture planes, its grain, its response to pressure. They understood friction well enough to move heavy blocks across ground that would otherwise swallow them. They knew how to make sand behave, wetting it, compacting it, reducing drag. They knew how to use levers and sledges and human coordination to turn weight into motion. And they knew something else we rarely discuss, the emotional architecture of labor. To build on this scale, you need more than tools. You need a society that can sustain the effort, feed people, organize them, motivate them, keep them committed through heat and exhaustion and years of repetition. Whether through faith, obligation, pride, or necessity, thousands of lives must align. The pyramid is not only stonecraft, it is social craft, a civilization arranging itself into a single act. Yet the pyramid still feels too precise, almost excessive. The base, level across an enormous footprint, suggests not merely competence, but perfectionism. The near cardinal alignment suggests not merely functionality, but a desire to match cosmic order. The internal layout suggests not merely storage, but intention. Passages that feel designed to guide movement, sightline, and perhaps sound. And sound is its own kind of stonecraft. Inside the pyramid, the acoustics shift. Certain spaces amplify. Certain tones resonate and linger. You can speak and hear your words return changed, thicker, more present. The grand gallery, with its high sloping walls, behaves like a throat. The chambers behave like resonant cavities. This could be coincidence, the byproduct of shape. Or it could be deliberate, shaped for ritual voices, for chants that needed to carry and return, for ceremonies that used vibration as part of meaning. The ancients understood sound more than we assume. They lived without mechanical noise. Their world was quieter, and in quiet worlds, resonance is obvious. A chant in a stone chamber would not feel like entertainment. It would feel like physics. It would feel like the building answering back. If the pyramid was inherited, these acoustic properties might have been discovered and folded into later ritual. If it was designed by Egyptians, they may have built with that knowledge intentionally. Either way, the stone becomes an instrument, and the craft becomes more than cutting and stacking. It becomes shaping experience. When you examine individual pyramid blocks, another detail emerges. The stones are not uniform. Each was cut slightly differently, fitted for its place like a puzzle piece. This implies planning at a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind without systems. It implies an understanding of three-dimensional assembly that modern builders often handle with digital modeling. The ancient builders did it without screens. They did it with lines, plumb bobs, sighting rods, shadow measurements, and trained eyes. They did it with a relationship to geometry that was practical, embodied. They did not study math as an abstraction. They used it. They lived it. Their geometry was not a theory. It was a tool that made stone obey. Some researchers have suggested subtle curvature in the pyramid's faces, slight concavity that could strengthen the structure and correct optical illusions. Whether intentional or the byproduct of construction methods, the effect is striking, a monument that does not impose itself crudely on the landscape but seems to harmonize with it. Craftsmanship elevated into philosophy. And yet the more intimately you look, the more the pyramid refuses to become simple. The quarry marks suggest manual labor, but the finished surfaces suggest calculation beyond trial and error. The logistics of transporting granite from Aswan suggest organized capability at a national scale. The precision of joins suggests attention to detail beyond what most monumental projects can afford. It feels as if multiple levels of intelligence were operating at once, the intelligence of bodies moving weight, and the intelligence of mind shaping proportion. That pairing, strength and design, is the signature of true craft. If we widen our gaze beyond Egypt, the question grows even stranger. There are other sites in the world where stones fit with similar tightness. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, with polygonal blocks that lock together like living joints. Ancient Japanese megaliths. Cyclopean walls in the Mediterranean. These places are separated by oceans and millennia, yet they share a certain obsession, making stone behave as if it were soft. Some interpret this as evidence of a shared lost technology or global tradition. Others see it as convergence, humans facing similar challenges and discovering similar solutions. Either way, it suggests that the impulse toward precision is not isolated. It appears whenever humans decide to build not for decades but for ages. The Great Pyramid may be the most famous expression of that impulse, but it is not necessarily the only one. Still, there is something about Giza that feels singular. Perhaps it is the scale. Perhaps it is the alignment. Perhaps it is the way the monument seems to hold the desert's silence rather than simply occupy it. Craft, at this level, becomes something like writing. The builders wrote an idea into the landscape using stone as ink, and the idea appears to be endurance. Modern construction often prioritizes speed. Buildings rise in months and fall in decades. We live in an age where permanence is rare and sometimes even unwanted, where renewal means demolition. But the ancients built as if time were a conversation partner. They built to speak across centuries, to send a message that could not be burned, drowned, or easily rewritten. To carve stone with that intention is to trust that the future will exist and that the future will care enough to look. That trust is astonishing. It is also deeply human. We inherit this impulse even now, though we express it differently. We archive data. We store knowledge in clouds and drives. We build networks meant to outlast individuals. We launch objects into orbit with golden records, hoping someone someday will hear. These are modern pyramids, attempts to preserve meaning against the erosion of time. The pyramid reminds us that this impulse is not new, and perhaps that is why the stone feels so intimate when you touch it. You're not just touching geology, you're touching a decision made by someone who believed the future mattered. In the light of dusk, when the sun begins to lower and the pyramid's face is warm in color, the monument seems to breathe. The limestone catches the last light and holds it, each block glowing softly before surrendering to shadow. The lines sharpen and then soften. Shadows slide with careful precision, as if the pyramid were a clock measuring time not in hours but in centuries. In those moments, it's easy to imagine the builders at work, not as faceless laborers, but as craftspeople with a relationship to stone that was almost intimate. Each block placed with attention, each measurement repeated until it was right, each day a small act of devotion to an invisible whole. Even if we never recover their complete methods, we can still feel their discipline. We can feel their patience. We can feel the stubborn tenderness of craft, the refusal to accept sloppy work when the goal is eternity. And as night settles again and the desert stillness returns, the pyramid holds its silence the way it always has. It does not need to explain itself to prove its existence. It simply stands. And through that standing, it transmits the most durable message craft can carry. Someone cared enough to make this exact. Someone believed precision mattered. Someone believed time was worth answering. And in that resonance, hands, stone, measurement, intention, another thread begins to rise. The thread of voices older than our written memory, myths that may be more than metaphor. Whispers carried forward not by paper but by the shape of a monument. Because craft at its deepest is not only technique, it is a way of remembering. When night settles over the desert, the air changes its texture. Heat releases its grip and drifts upward. The wind softens and the silence deepens into something you can almost feel against your skin. In that kind of quiet, it becomes easy to imagine that stillness itself holds memory. That somewhere between sand grain and limestone seam, something ancient is still speaking. Not in sentences, not in modern clarity, in impressions, in the way a place makes you slow down without asking, in the way your mind begins to reach backward, as if it recognizes a rhythm older than your own life. The voices of the ancients were never loud. They didn't need to be. Loudness is what we use when we are afraid we will be ignored. The ancient voice is patient. It waits. It lingers inside symbols, inside proportions, inside the way a structure meets the horizon. And if you stay long enough in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, you can begin to sense how a monument becomes a kind of throat for a civilization, speaking even after the language that built it has gone silent. The Egyptians believed, with unwavering seriousness, that nothing truly died. To them, existence changed shape. A name spoken kept a soul present. Forgetting was the only true death. That belief shaped everything they built, because building was their way of refusing forgetting. Their carvings are calm for a reason. Their statues stare through centuries for a reason. The monuments were designed not only to endure physically but to maintain presence. But if Egypt inherited the Great Pyramid, then the oldest presence there might not be Egyptian at all. It might be layered beneath Egyptian meaning, like older ink beneath newer writing. The myths Egypt told were already echoes when they were first spoken beside the Nile. And myths, for all their exaggeration, have a strange habit of carrying true bones. Across the world's oldest cultures, the stories repeat with unsettling similarity. A golden age, a fall, a flood that resets the world. Teachers who arrive after catastrophe bringing knowledge, writing, astronomy, measurement, back to humanity like fire carried in careful hands. Egypt speaks of Thoth, the bringer of wisdom and record-keeping. Sumer speaks of Enki, clever and protective, preserving knowledge against the coming deluge. Greece speaks of Prometheus, giving fire and craft. Many traditions speak of divine or semi-divine beings who taught humans the structure of civilization. Modern minds often treat these as symbolic narratives, and they are, of course. But symbols sometimes form around real experiences, collapses, migrations, encounters with remnants of older knowledge. A civilization does not need literal gods to produce God stories. It only needs to meet a phenomenon it cannot explain. Something too advanced, too enduring, too precise. Something like a perfect mountain of stone standing in the desert with no clear origin. If early Egyptians found monuments whose methods they could not fully reconstruct, what else could they call the builders but gods? In ancient thought, deity and ancestor blur easily. A being from the distant past becomes divine because time itself sanctifies it. The older something is, the more authority it carries. That is why origin stories are sacred. They are about firstness, and firstness feels like power. When we read the earliest Egyptian funerary texts, the pyramid texts and later coffin texts, we find language full of ascent, transformation, star journeys, and cosmic gates. The dead king rises, becomes imperishable, joins the circumpolar stars, sails with the sun. These images are often treated as metaphor, but they are also architectural. The pyramid itself is built like a diagram of ascent. Its narrow passages climb. Its internal geometry funnels attention upward. Its shafts point to stars. It's as if the monument and the mythology are two expressions of the same idea, that the human can travel between worlds. If that idea is older than dynastic Egypt, then the Great Pyramid could be the physical container that helped preserve it. A kind of memory device for civilization. Not a library of paper, but a library of proportion. Here's a thought that lingers longer than it should. Architecture can preserve information the way writing does, sometimes longer. A building can encode alignments, ratios, orientations, and sequences. It can store astronomical knowledge in stone without ever using ink. If a civilization feared catastrophe, flood, drought, invasion, then encoding knowledge into massive, immovable forms would be a rational choice. A storm can burn books, a flood can wash away scrolls, but a mountain of stone aligned to the sky is harder to erase. This is why the old legends about buried knowledge persist around Giza. Medieval Arab writers described hidden chambers under the pyramids containing maps of the heavens, sciences, and records of a world before the flood. Most scholars dismiss these accounts as later imagination, yet the instinct behind them is telling. Even centuries ago, people sensed that the pyramid felt like storage, not necessarily for gold, but for something less tangible, for order, for memory, for instruction. Some nights, standing on the plateau, you can feel how easily a person could believe the pyramid was a kind of machine. Not a modern machine with gears, but an ancient machine of meaning. A device designed to align mind and cosmos. A ritual instrument that turns sky movement into human thought. And then there is sound again, that strange bridge between the physical and the invisible. Inside the pyramid, the way your voice behaves can feel uncanny. Certain chambers swallow sound, others return it. In some spaces, a low hum seems to appear in the silence, not always audible but sensed, like pressure. This can be explained by acoustics and resonance, by geometry and air volume, but imagine how it would have felt to ancient ears not dulled by constant mechanical noise. A chant in such a space would feel like it awakened the stone, like the monument answered back. In that experience, voices of the ancients become something literal. Voices bouncing, layering, returning. Words becoming vibration, vibration becoming presence. Sound is energy. Energy moves through material. And while stone does not record sound the way a modern device does, it does carry the memory of vibration in subtle ways. At the very least, the human mind associates certain spaces with certain tones, and those associations become tradition. A chamber becomes holy because it makes prayer feel larger than the mouth that speaks it. The ancients understood this without needing a physics textbook. They understood it because their world was quiet enough to notice. So perhaps the pyramid was not merely a place to store a king. Perhaps it was a place to transform experience, to make humans feel the cosmos in their bones. If so, then later myths about gods and ascension are not random fantasies. They are attempts to describe what the architecture does. And still the larger question hovers, whose architecture was it first? If the Egyptians inherited the pyramid, they inherited its effects. They may have walked its passages and felt something they could not name. They may have sensed that the monument belonged to an older order. And rather than discard it, they would have done what human beings always do with overwhelming experiences. They told stories that could contain them. Over time, those stories solidified into religion. But religion in ancient cultures was also science in disguise. Astronomy embedded in myth. Calendar knowledge embedded in ritual. The stories carried timing. When the river would rise, when the stars would return, when the solstice would arrive. The gods were faces on cycles. To worship was to pay attention. To keep order was to track reality. If earlier peoples had already mapped these cycles deeply, if they had encoded them into monuments, then later Egyptians could have inherited not just a building, but a worldview that treated observation as sacred. This may be why Egypt's symbols feel so consistent across millennia. The ankh, the scarab, the solar disk, the eye of Horus. These images persist because they are not merely decorative. They are shorthand for cycles, life, rebirth, sun's journey, protection, order. They are the vocabulary of continuity. And continuity is the one thing a civilization emerging from catastrophe would crave. Across the world, flood myths repeat with specific emotional tone. Not just fear, but mourning. A sense of, we had something, and it was taken. Even when details differ, the feeling is similar. The world was once more stable. Then it changed. Survivors rebuilt, but they remembered that they were rebuilding, that they were inheriting fragments. Egypt's own myths speak of primeval waters, of creation emerging from chaos. That motif is not only philosophical, it could be a cultural memory of real environmental transformation, of lands drowned, of wetlands drying, of a world reshaped. If a civilization existed before dynastic Egypt, call it what you will, advanced or simply earlier, its survivors might have carried knowledge forward in story form, embedding technical observations inside sacred language. Over generations, the technical content might fade, leaving the sacred shell. But the shell would still guide behavior. It would still steer architecture toward the sky. It would still preserve orientation. It would still insist that the cosmos matters. This is how a vanished culture can persist without being named. Not as a nation, but as an influence. A ghost inside practices. A melody inside myths. Sometimes, the most haunting voice is not a spoken one. It's a pattern that keeps repeating itself despite changing hands. And the Great Pyramid is nothing if not a pattern made enormous. Under moonlight, the monument appears less like a building and more like a presence. Its edges soften. Its mass becomes a dark certainty. The sand around it glows pale. The sky above it widens. In that stillness, you can almost feel layers of time stacked like the blocks themselves. Each joint a century, each seam a forgotten name. The air seems full of languages no one speaks anymore. Yet the meaning does not feel gone. It feels waiting. That is the quiet truth I return to again and again as echoes of the forgotten earth. The past is not behind us in the way we imagine. It is beneath us, around us, inside the structures we inherit. It is folded into ritual, into art, into the way humans still look upward and feel the same smallness, the same awe. The voices of the ancients are still here because the questions are still here. Who came before? What did they know? What did they fear enough to build against? What did they love enough to preserve? And as we listen, another thread begins to appear in the dark. Not myth now, but hypothesis. The notion that an entire chapter of human civilization may have vanished beneath rising seas and shifting climates, leaving only scattered monuments like bones. This is where the story turns next. Toward the idea of a vanished civilization, not as fantasy, but as the stubborn possibility that history has missing pages, and that the Great Pyramid may be one of the few sentences that survived. When people look at the Great Pyramid and ask who built it, they're rarely asking only about labor. They're asking something deeper, even if they don't realize it. They're asking whether humanity has lived more than one life, whether our story is older than our records, whether civilization is a single upward climb or a series of awakenings, each one rising, breaking, and returning like a wave. That is where the idea of a vanished civilization takes root. Not as a glittering fantasy, but as a question that refuses to die. What if the people who raised the earliest monuments, who aligned stone to stars with unnerving accuracy, weren't the first of us, but the last of someone else? What if what we call the dawn of civilization is actually the dawn of a rebuilding? The notion is ancient in itself. Every generation seems to rediscover it in a new accent. Plato gave it one of its most famous names, Atlantis. He described an island nation powerful and sophisticated, brought down in a single terrible day and night, swallowed by the sea. For Plato, it was a moral lesson, a story about pride, imbalance, and collapse. But he also claimed he received the story through Egypt, through priests who told him their memory stretched farther back than Greek memory could. Even if Atlantis is allegory, it sits at a strange intersection where myth and geology shake hands, because the end of the last ice age was not gentle. It was a global rearrangement. Sea levels rose dramatically, over 300 feet, drowning coastlines that once held fertile plains, river mouths, and human settlements. Regions now underwater were once the most hospitable places to live, the natural homes of early communities, deltas rich with food, shorelines teeming with life, flatlands ideal for movement and gathering. If there were early centers of culture, proto-cities, trade hubs, ceremonial sites, many of them could now lie under layers of ocean sediment beyond the reach of ordinary excavation. Not destroyed by fire, not conquered by armies, simply erased by water. In that sense, vanished civilization is not only a poetic idea, it is a geological possibility. We tend to imagine ancient people living inland because that is where the surviving evidence is. But people, then as now, were drawn to water. They settled along coasts and rivers. If the coasts flooded, the evidence flooded with them. What remains on land might be the backup copy of a much larger story. And when a story loses its main chapters, the surviving pages can look like sudden miracles. That is one reason places like Göbekli Tepe shook the timeline so deeply. Built more than 11,000 years ago, it appeared from an era we had labeled too early for monumental architecture. Its carved pillars and organized design suggested not only skill but social coordination, long-term planning, and symbolism. It was not a random pile of stones. It was intent expressed in mass. If that kind of intent existed then, what else existed that we have not yet found, or can no longer find because it lies under water, under sand, under the slow pressure of time? Around the world, certain patterns repeat. Megalithic sites built from stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons, joints fitted so tightly that modern builders still admire them. Structures oriented to solstices and star risings, calendrical alignments embedded in temples, geometry expressed in places where survival would have seemed the only priority. These patterns are not proof of a single global culture. They could be convergence, humans independently discovering that the sky is the most reliable clock and that stone is the most durable medium. But convergence can still reveal something important. When humans reach stability, their minds turn upward. They start to measure. They start to encode. They start to leave messages for time. The Great Pyramid in this light feels less like an outlier and more like a peak, one of the clearest expressions of that impulse toward permanence. If a civilization existed before the dynasties, call it advanced, call it early, call it simply forgotten, it would not need impossible technology to feel beyond to its descendants. It would only need continuity long enough to refine observation, to track the sky for many generations, to develop a tradition of measurement, to understand cycles deeply. That knowledge alone, if lost and later rediscovered, would feel miraculous. And if catastrophe came, floods, climate collapse, sudden sea rise, the survivors would carry what they could. Not monuments, not infrastructure. They would carry stories, symbols, rituals, and the stubborn habits of attention. They would carry a sense that alignment matters, that certain stars are important, that certain ratios feel right. They would carry the shape of knowledge even if the technical details dissolved. This is how a vanished civilization can seed later ones without leaving obvious fingerprints. Imagine people moving inland as waters rise. Imagine them arriving among communities less developed in certain practices, bringing with them fragments, star lore, geometry, methods of organizing labor, even the concept of building for eternity. Over time, those fragments become integrated. The receiving culture absorbs them, reshapes them, eventually believes it invented them. The donors become mythic teachers, gods, sages, civilizers, and the old world becomes a flood story. Flood myths appear nearly everywhere. Mesopotamia speaks of a deluge that wipes out humanity and leaves a survivor with a boat and a burden of renewal. India speaks of Manu warned by a fish, preserving life through catastrophe. Indigenous traditions across continents describe waters rising, land sinking, people fleeing, knowledge being saved. Details differ, but the emotional tone is similar. The world changed, and we were forced to begin again. To skeptics, this can be explained as the universal human experience of local floods, elevated into myth. That's a fair argument. Rivers flood, coastal storms devastate. People tell stories. But the end of the last ice age was not local. It was global. It was a long series of changes punctuated by sudden events, meltwater pulses, rapid sea rise, chaotic climate swings. It is not unreasonable to think such an era would leave deep marks on collective memory. Plato's dates for Atlantis, around 9,000 years before his time, place it roughly in that window of upheaval. That does not prove Atlantis existed, but it does suggest his story may echo an older remembrance of real environmental trauma. Perhaps Egypt, with its ancient priesthood and obsession with record-keeping, preserved fragments of such memory longer than most places. Egyptian priests, according to some accounts, told Greeks that Greece had been reset by catastrophe many times, that only Egypt remained stable enough to remember. Whether or not we accept that claim literally, it reflects Egypt's self-image, guardian of continuity, keeper of ancient cycles. If Egypt inherited the Great Pyramid, that self-image becomes even more powerful. The pyramid would be physical proof that continuity can survive resets, that even if civilizations collapse, some things remain to teach the next ones. Some researchers argue that the Great Pyramid encodes mathematical and geodetic knowledge, pi-like ratios, golden proportion, even Earth-scale measurements. Skeptics rightly warn that humans often find meaning after the fact. But even if only part of that is intentional, the message would be striking. A monument designed as a durable container for principles, not treasure. A stone diagram of the world. Such a monument makes sense in a context of catastrophe. If you believe the world may reset, you build a memory anchor. You do not trust paper. You do not trust fragile archives. You trust stone and sky. And perhaps you trust that someone, someday, will look up and wonder, The idea of a vanished civilization is not, at its core, about lost machines. It is about lost continuity. It is about the fragility of culture and the stubbornness of curiosity. A society can be brilliant and still disappear if its environment shifts faster than its institutions can adapt. The survivors may carry wisdom, but lose the means to express it at full scale. In that scenario, the advanced civilization doesn't vanish completely. It becomes diluted. It lives on as influence, as myth, as inherited habits. The next civilization rises and claims the inheritance as its own, and the old one becomes a whisper. This is why the Great Pyramid feels like a whisper made loud. It could be a bridge between worlds, a message from one cycle to the next. It is also why the search for other remnants persists. If the pyramid is a survivor, then perhaps there are other survivors, buried under dunes, hidden beneath cities, submerged along ancient coastlines. The ocean floor may hold foundations disguised as natural ridges. The desert may cover stonework that looks like geology until someone measures the angles. Geometry hiding inside Earth. And Earth is good at hiding things, not maliciously, patiently. The vanished civilization hypothesis, held carefully, is less a declaration than an invitation to humility. It says, the timeline we have is likely incomplete. Our certainty may be louder than our evidence. We should remain open to the possibility that civilization's story is older and more cyclical than our textbooks prefer, because textbooks crave clean beginnings. The Earth does not provide them. If a vanished civilization once existed, it may not have been global. It may not have been uniform. It may have been pockets, networks, communities of high skill connected by trade and shared sky knowledge. The ocean rise could have severed those connections. Inland migrations could have scattered specialists. Within a few generations, the integrated system collapses into fragments. What remains are monuments, myths, and instincts. And among those remnants, the Great Pyramid stands with uncomfortable confidence. It looks less like a first attempt and more like a culmination, less like an origin and more like a surviving summit. The kind of work you build when you already know what you are doing, and you believe you may not get another chance. When I stand with this thought as echoes of the forgotten Earth, I do not feel excitement in the way a conspiracy story excites. I feel something quieter. A respect for time's ability to erase and preserve at once. A recognition that human brilliance is older than our pride allows, and a tenderness for the idea that our ancestors may have built not only for their gods, but for us, for strangers across millennia who would inherit their questions. And that inheritance leads to an even more unsettling idea. If civilizations can vanish and return, then history does not move forward like a straight road. It resets, it resumes, it repeats. The pyramid, then, would not be a mystery in isolation. It would be evidence of a larger rhythm, one in which the Earth periodically rearranges the human story, and humans rebuild with whatever memory survives. That rhythm is where we go next. When history resets itself, it rarely does so with a clean line drawn across the calendar. There is no trumpet announcing the end of an era, no official boundary between before and after. Reset is quieter than that. It arrives like weather, first as a subtle shift, then as a reality you can't argue with. Crops fail, rivers change, shores retreat, people move. The old ways stop fitting the new world, and what once felt permanent begins to feel fragile. The most unsettling thing about a reset is that it happens while life continues. Children are still born, people still fall in love, fires are still lit at night. But beneath those ordinary moments, the foundations of continuity are shifting. The knowledge that depended on stability, institutions, specialists, long apprenticeships, becomes vulnerable. And when a civilization loses its ability to pass on complexity, it doesn't always lose everything at once. It loses connections first. It loses the deep context that makes knowledge usable. It keeps fragments, enough to spark future rebuilding, but not enough to preserve the whole system intact. That is how an age can end without leaving an ending. If the Great Pyramid belongs to such a rhythm, whether as origin, inheritance, or both, then it is less a monument of one dynasty and more a marker of continuity through catastrophe. A structure designed not merely to stand, but to stand through resets. We like to imagine history as steady progress, a climb from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. It's a comforting image because it suggests safety. If the arrow points upward, then tomorrow will be better than today. But the earth doesn't move like an arrow. It moves like a cycle, like breath, like seasons. Ice ages come and go. Deserts bloom and dry. Rivers wander. Sea levels rise and fall. The planet rearranges itself repeatedly, and human civilization, no matter how brilliant, has always been built on the assumption that the ground will keep behaving. When the ground changes, history does not go backward. It breaks into pieces. And then, later, someone collects those pieces and begins again. You can see the pattern not only in the deep past, but in the nearer one. Empires collapse and knowledge narrows. Libraries burn and centuries of learning become rumor. Languages die and entire philosophies become unreadable. Then, a later culture rediscovers fragments and calls the rediscovery Renaissance, as if rebirth were invention. Europe's Renaissance was, in many ways, a remembering. Greek geometry, Roman engineering, ancient texts brought back into the light. The knowledge had never stopped existing. It had stopped being connected. History does this at every scale, small resets inside large ones. Now imagine that pattern at planetary scale. At the end of the Ice Age, when coastlines vanished and climates shifted rapidly. Imagine networks collapsing. Imagine specialized knowledge thinning. Imagine survivors moving inland, carrying only what could fit inside stories, rituals, and habits. In such a world, a monument like the Great Pyramid becomes not just impressive, but purposeful. It becomes a defiance, a statement against the forgetfulness that catastrophe brings. Perhaps the builders, whether dynastic Egyptians or earlier hands, understood that civilizations are fragile. Perhaps they built as if they knew a future age would need proof that order is possible. Not a written proof, but a physical one. Geometry that cannot be argued with, alignment that does not depend on language, proportion that can be rediscovered by anyone with eyes and patience. Stone as a memory anchor. When people speak of the pyramid encoding pi or geodetic measurements or golden proportions, the debate often turns bitter. Coincidence versus intention, pattern finding versus design. But there is a quieter way to hold the question. Even if only some relationships are intentional, even if the builders were simply pursuing harmony without naming constants, the result is still meaningful. It is still a monument built as if measurement mattered beyond the immediate needs of burial or prestige. That, as if, is important. The pyramid behaves as if it belongs to a worldview in which the cosmos is a system and humans are capable of aligning with it. That worldview is itself a form of knowledge. And knowledge is what resets threaten most. This is why Egypt's obsession with continuity can feel less like vanity and more like defense. Egypt built to resist chaos. It built tombs to keep names alive. It carved rituals into stone to keep them from evaporating. It measured time through stars and floods as if measurement itself were sacred. This intensity makes even more sense if Egypt was born in the wake of environmental transformation. The Sahara drying, populations concentrating, the memory of an older world fading. A culture emerging from a shrinking landscape would naturally worship stability. If the Great Pyramid predates Egypt, it might have been one of the last stable things left from a previous order, adopted as proof that permanence can exist. If the Great Pyramid is Egyptian, it could still be a response to the same fear, the desire to anchor a civilization against the possibility of reset. Either way, the monument speaks the language of resistance. History resets and resumes in a way that can look like sudden leaps to later scholars. We see a society shift from mud brick to stone and call it a miracle. But perhaps it is not a miracle. Perhaps it is a resumption, a revival of knowledge fragments finally finding enough stability to become architecture again. In a reset world, knowledge survives like embers. Some embers glow in myth, some glow in ritual, some glow in the muscle memory of craft. When the conditions become right, when food supply stabilizes, when society organizes, when leadership consolidates, those embers can flare into full flame. The result looks like sudden sophistication. Egypt's early dynastic burst could be such a flame. And the Great Pyramid, standing at the edge of desert and river, could be the brightest expression of that flare, or the inherited ember that lit it. There is an old phrase in archaeology: continuity through catastrophe. It means that even when a world collapses, something always survives to seed the next one. The pyramid embodies this literally by surviving earthquakes, invasions, and erosion, but it also embodies it symbolically. It survives as an idea, an engine of wonder that keeps pulling minds back to the same questions. Every age projects itself onto the pyramid. To the ancient Egyptians, it was divine order. To medieval scholars, it was secret wisdom. To modern engineers, it is a marvel of logistics and mathematics. To skeptics, it is proof of human labor and organization. To dreamers, it is a doorway. All of them may be partly right because the pyramid is big enough to hold many meanings. That too is a form of resilience. A monument survives longer when it can be reinterpreted, when it can become new without changing its stones. In that sense, the pyramid is not only built to endure physically, it is built to endure culturally. It can live through resets because each new civilization can adopt it, translate it, make it theirs without needing to know the original dialect. And yet, the original dialect still seems to hum faintly through the geometry. Standing at dawn on the plateau, you can watch the first light sharpen the pyramid's edges. For a few minutes, the monument looks newly made. The lines are crisp. The shadows move with precise inevitability. The scene feels like a demonstration, proof that cycles govern everything. Day follows night. Light follows darkness. The earth turns, and the monument remains. This is the quiet lesson of resets. Everything changes, and yet patterns persist. Civilizations rise and fall, but the sky continues its slow drift. Stars shift by precession. The sun returns. The river floods and retreats. The desert advances and withdraws grain by grain. In the middle of these cycles, humans build, sometimes successfully, sometimes briefly, trying to anchor themselves in what feels stable. The Great Pyramid is the strongest anchor we know. If history resets again, and it will in some form because the earth does not promise stability forever, what will remain? Our digital archives are fragile in their own way. Our cities depend on systems that can fail. Our knowledge is vast, but it is also distributed and dependent on electricity, networks, institutions. Stone, by contrast, is stubborn. Perhaps this is why the pyramid still matters. Not because it proves any single theory, but because it reminds us that civilizations can forget, that our confidence in linear progress is a luxury. That endurance requires humility, not only ingenuity. If the builders of Giza understood that, then the pyramid is not merely an ancient artifact. It is a warning wrapped in beauty. A reminder that the human story is not guaranteed to keep moving forward smoothly, and that the only reliable inheritance we can pass across catastrophes is what we can encode into durable forms, into culture, into ritual, into architecture, into the stubborn habit of asking questions. Because the question itself can survive even when the answer is lost. As echoes of the forgotten earth, I return to this again and again. The most powerful thing the pyramid preserves is not a king, not treasure, not a specific doctrine. It preserves the continuity of wonder. It ensures that even after resets, someone will stand here again, look up, look down, and ask, who came before? What did they know? What did they fear? What did they want us to remember? And now, as we approach the final stretch of our quiet journey, we drift toward the idea that this monument is not only a relic of the past, but a mirror of human longing, a human dream made durable. Because beneath all theories, beneath all debates, there's a simpler truth. People built this, whether first or last, whether original or inheritor, because they wanted to touch eternity. That is where we go next, into the human dream of permanence, the desire that makes us stack stones, write stories, map stars, and refuse to accept that time should have the final word. There's a moment, brief, almost delicate, when the sun rises over the Giza Plateau and the Great Pyramid catches the light in a way that makes it look awake. The edges sharpen, the face of the stone brightens. The shadow pulls itself long across the sand like a slow thought stretching after sleep. For a few minutes, the monument seems less like something built and more like something that has always been there, as if it is not participating in time so much as hosting it. People have watched that same light for thousands of years. Farmers and priests, travelers and conquerors, scholars with measuring rods and modern tourists with phones held up like talismans. Each person arrives with a different story, but the light hits the same angles. The geometry does not change its mind. And in that repeatable moment, something human stirs, something older than language. Because the pyramid at its core is not only a mystery of engineering, it is the shape of a human dream. To dream, for our species, is to build. We imagine something that does not yet exist, and then we insist on giving it weight. We push an idea out of the mind and into the world until it can outlast the body that imagined it. A campfire circle becomes a village becomes a city, a story becomes a law, a prayer becomes a cathedral, a measurement becomes a monument. The Great Pyramid is the most distilled version of that impulse. Thought made heavy, idea made immovable. We often assume monuments are built for ego, for kings who want to be remembered. Sometimes that's true. But ego alone doesn't explain the particular calm of this structure. The Great Pyramid does not feel like a shout. It feels like a statement spoken slowly, with the confidence of someone who believes time will listen. Its base is wide and steady, a grounded certainty. Its apex rises toward the sky, a single point where all sides meet. The shape itself suggests a psychological truth. Humans live between what we know and what we cannot know, between Earth and stars, between the weight of matter and the pull of the infinite. The pyramid stands exactly in that in-between. And that is why it feels so familiar, even when it is incomprehensible. You can feel it in your body. The mass calms something. The symmetry quiets something. The proportions, whether consciously decoded or simply sensed, give the mind a kind of rest. There is a reason sacred architecture across cultures tends to favor harmony. Certain spaces soothe because they echo patterns the brain finds stable. The Great Pyramid is stability made visible. And yet, it is also audacity. Because to build something that durable is to argue with impermanence itself. It is to say, yes, everything changes, but we can still leave a mark that does not immediately dissolve. That defiance is not childish. It is not denial. It is a recognition of fragility paired with a refusal to let fragility be the final story. If the pyramid was built as a tomb, it was a tomb that refused to accept ordinary death. If it was built as an instrument, it was an instrument designed to endure longer than its operators. If it was built as a message across resets, it was a message that trusted the future enough to believe someone would return to read it. Whatever its original intent, the underlying dream is the same: to converse with eternity. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the pyramids as machines of ascent, not mechanical, but spiritual. Structures meant to assist the dead in rising to join the imperishable stars. The king becomes a star. The soul becomes light. The afterlife is not a shadow world but a continuation in a different form. It is easy for modern minds to treat this as metaphor, but the metaphor is not accidental. The architecture itself behaves like a diagram of ascent. Corridors rise, shafts aim, chambers sit like stations in a journey. Whether those features were originally designed for ritual or reinterpreted later, the building invites the story of upward movement. An upward movement is the oldest human gesture. We lift our faces to the sky instinctively. We search for order above because the ground is always changing beneath us. The sky becomes the stable reference point, the cosmic ruler we press against the mess of life to see if it still lines up. The Great Pyramid presses itself against that ruler. Its alignment to true north is not only a technical achievement, it is a symbolic one. It says, "We know where we are. We know which way the world turns. We can locate ourselves in the larger system. We are not lost." This need not be mystical. It is psychological. Humans fear disorientation. We fear chaos. We fear the feeling that nothing holds. So we build structures that hold, and we place them in relationship to things that outlast us. That is what the pyramid does. It ties itself to cardinal directions, to the sun's path, to the stars. It anchors human meaning to cosmic continuity. And in doing so, it becomes a mirror of human aspiration. Even our modern structures echo the same geometry. Skyscrapers taper as they rise. Towers narrow toward the sky. We stack stories, literally and metaphorically, until a single point of intention stands above the rest. Our data centers are pyramids of memory in another form, vast foundations supporting delicate information meant to outlive individuals. Our satellites carry our symbols into orbit. Our probes carry our music and our languages on golden discs, as if we can't help trying to whisper, "We were here," into the dark. We are still building pyramids. We just call them by different names. The difference is that our modern monuments often assume continued stability, electricity, networks, maintenance. The Great Pyramid assumes none of that. It is designed to endure, neglect. It is built as if the builders understood that the future is not guaranteed to care for what we make. That assumption is sobering. It suggests either profound wisdom or profound experience. Perhaps the builders had seen collapse before. Perhaps they had watched knowledge disappear. Perhaps they built with the memory of loss in mind. Or perhaps they simply understood, as all mature minds eventually do, that time erodes everything except what is made from stubborn material and stubborn meaning. There's another quiet aspect of the dream the pyramid represents. The dream of unity. Modern thinking slices the world into categories. Science here, religion there, art over there. But the pyramid looks like the product of a mind that did not slice that way. Its engineering is also symbolic. Its geometry is also narrative. Its alignment is also devotion. It embodies a worldview in which truth is not compartmentalized. That unity is something we still long for, even if we rarely admit it. We want our lives to make sense as a whole. We want our knowledge to feel connected to our meaning. We want our work to be more than survival. The Great Pyramid stands as proof, real or imagined, that such unity can be built. And that is why people continue to argue about it. Not only because it is difficult, but because it touches a nerve. It suggests the possibility that human beings, at some point, achieved a clarity of purpose so strong they could carve it into stone and leave it standing for millennia. Whether that clarity belonged to dynastic Egypt, to forgotten builders, or to both layered together, the dream is still there in the shape. At night, when the plateau cools and the sky fills, the pyramid returns to silhouette. The stars appear, steady, ancient, and the monument becomes a dark peak beneath them. Orion climbs. The Milky Way stretches like pale smoke. The world feels larger than any single era. In that darkness, the pyramid's presence becomes less about what we can prove and more about what we can feel. The sensation of continuity. The awareness that human beings have always looked up and tried to answer the same quiet questions. What are we? Where are we? How do we stay connected to what endures? The Great Pyramid is one answer to those questions. not in words, but in form. It is the human dream of permanence made physical. It says, we can align ourselves with the cosmos. We can build something stable in a shifting world. We can leave a mark that survives the resets. And yet it does not claim victory over time. It accepts time. It collaborates with it. That may be its deepest wisdom. The pyramid does not defy gravity. It uses gravity. It does not fight erosion. It chooses materials and proportions that slow it. It does not demand the future's attention. It simply remains until attention returns. That is why it feels almost alive. Not because it moves, but because it participates in cycles. Day and night. Light and shadow. Heat and cold. Wind and stillness. The pyramid lets these cycles happen and stays stable through them. It becomes a lesson in endurance, not rigidity, but balance. And balance, Mat, is exactly what Egypt worshipped. Maybe the pyramid taught them that worship. Maybe they found it and recognized the lesson. Maybe they built it and then built their civilization around the same principle. However the direction of influence runs, the result is the same, a monument that continues to shape minds. As we near the end of this quiet journey, I want to hold the dream gently rather than pin it down, because the pyramid itself refuses to be pinned. It remains ambiguous, and perhaps it must. A structure that has lived through so many interpretations may have been designed to accept them. It may have been built to survive not only earthquakes, but human storytelling. And human storytelling is relentless. We need meaning the way we need water. When we inherit mystery, we drink it and transform it into myth, science, art, argument. We build theories, we build documentaries, we build entire identities around what a single stone mountain might mean. All of this is part of the same dream, to belong to something larger than our brief lives. The Great Pyramid, whether built by Egyptians, inherited by them, or shaped by layers of both, offers that belonging. It invites us to step out of our century and stand in a continuum of wondering, because in the end, perhaps the true monument is not the pyramid itself. Perhaps the true monument is the unbroken chain of curiosity it keeps alive. And that is the inheritance we carry forward now, into the final part of our story, where wonder becomes the last surviving artifact, the one thing no catastrophe fully destroys. When night fully settles over Giza, the world becomes very quiet. The wind thins into a whisper. The desert cools and tightens, as if the land is pulling its breath inward. The last traces of sunset cling to the pyramid's edges for a moment, faint, stubborn, then dissolve, leaving the monument in silhouette beneath a sky that feels endlessly deep. In that darkness, it becomes clear why this place refuses to leave the human mind. The Great Pyramid is not only a structure you can measure, it is a space where time feels different. Not slower exactly, not faster, just less insistent. You stand beside stone that has outlasted empires, and the usual urgency of modern life falls away. Not because you've been convinced, but because the monument's endurance makes haste seem strange. And that is when the simplest truth arrives. The one thing that survives every reset, every collapse, every loss of records is wonder. Not information, not names, not dates. Wonder. We talk about inheritance as if it were made of objects. Land, gold, artifacts, written history. But the deeper inheritance is quieter. It is the instinct to ask, the urge to look at the world and feel that it is larger than you, and that you have a relationship with that largeness. It is the impulse that makes a person step closer to a stone wall and run fingers along seams as if touch could translate time. The Egyptians inherited that impulse, whether from their own ancestors or from older peoples whose traces dissolved into legend. And they built a civilization that treated curiosity as sacred. Not curiosity in the noisy sense of novelty, but curiosity as attention, as alignment, as the habit of living awake to to cycles. That habit is older than Egypt, older than any dynasty. It may be the oldest human habit there is. Because even before we had writing, we watched. We watched stars. We watched animal migrations. We watched the moon change shape. We watched water rise and retreat. We watched the sun return. We learned that the world has rhythm, and that rhythm can be trusted even when everything else feels uncertain. The Great Pyramid is an artifact of that trust. It stands like a physical memory of attention, alignment made permanent, measurement made immovable, a decision made so durable that it continues to affect minds thousands of years later. Whether the pyramid was built by Khufu's Egypt, inherited from forgotten builders, or shaped through layers of both, it continues to do what true monuments do. It makes people stop. It makes people look. It makes people ask. And it does so without speaking. Its silence is not empty. It is generous. It does not tell you what to think. It does not instruct you with inscriptions. It does not demand belief. It offers only presence and proportion, leaving you to bring your own mind to the encounter. That is why it has survived spiritually as well as physically. A monument that dictates meaning will eventually become outdated as cultures change. A monument that invites meaning can be reborn endlessly. This is the pyramid's quiet genius. It is adaptable without changing its stones. Scientists approach it with instruments and models, and it becomes a problem of engineering, an argument about ramps, tool marks, workforce logistics, and construction timelines. Mystics approach it with intuition, and it becomes a temple of resonance, an amplifier of inner states, a symbol of ascension. Historians approach it with chronicles, and it becomes a hinge in the story of Egypt's rise. Geologists approach it through erosion and weathering, and it becomes a question mark in the timeline of climate. Each approach reveals something true, even if none of them feels complete. The pyramid can hold all of it, because the pyramid is not only about the past, it is about the human mind meeting mystery and refusing to turn away. If the Egyptians were heirs, then their greatest achievement may not have been the first placement of stone, but the transformation of an inherited object into a living center of meaning. They took whatever was there, whether it was newly built or already ancient, and they made it part of a system of continuity. They bound it to stars. They bound it to cycles. They bound it to the idea that order exists and must be maintained. In doing so, they preserved the monument. They carried it forward. And now we carry it forward too, through study, through storytelling, through the simple act of remembering that it exists. This is why, in the end, the question, who built it, matters less than we think. Not because origins don't matter, they do, but because the pyramid's power does not depend on a single answer. Its power comes from its ability to keep the question alive, to keep the human mind awake, to keep curiosity moving, generation after generation, like wind moving across the plateau. There is a tenderness hidden inside that realization. We often want history to be settled so we can relax. But the deeper relaxation sometimes comes not from certainty, but from accepting that mystery is part of being human. That not every door opens into a clean explanation. That some monuments are meant to be met, not solved, lived with, not conquered. The Great Pyramid in this reading becomes a kind of teacher. It teaches patience. It teaches humility. It teaches perspective. It reminds us that human lives are brief, but human curiosity is continuous. It is a thread that can stretch across millennia even when names snap and empires fall. This is the inheritance of wonder, the unbroken chain of attention. And perhaps that is what the forgotten builders, if they existed, were trying to preserve. Not their identities, not their politics, not their language, but the ability for a future human to stand before their work and feel the same stirring they once felt. The need to align, to measure, to connect earth to sky. It is possible they knew they would be forgotten. It is possible they built accordingly. When you think of all the ways a civilization can disappear, flood, drought, war, migration, disease, the idea of building a monument as a safeguard against total erasure becomes less strange. It becomes almost practical in a poetic way. If you can't preserve your stories, preserve your questions. Preserve the structure that provokes them. Because questions can seed new knowledge. A future civilization may not know your language, but it can still recognize geometry. It can still measure. It can still look at alignment and understand that someone cared. Someone aimed at the sky with intention. That recognition is enough to begin again. And so, standing at Giza under the stars, we become part of the same continuity. We stand where others stood. We ask what they asked. We feel what they felt. Not identical, not perfectly, but close enough that time folds a little. Close enough that the distance between ancient and modern becomes thin. The desert around us continues its slow movement. Grain by grain, it covers and uncovers, forgets and reveals. The earth does not hurry. It knows that everything is temporary except the cycles themselves. The pyramid stays, not because it is invincible, but because it was built with an understanding of time's habits. It was built to cooperate with what erodes. It was built to last long enough for new eyes to find it again and again. And the stars above it keep moving in their slow processional drift, shifting the sky's map by degrees across millennia. Orion rises, the Milky Way stretches, the same light falls on the same stone in slightly different angles each age, and each age calls that light its own. There's something deeply comforting in that. The world changes, but the dialogue continues. So if you ever find yourself awake at night, mind too loud, day too close, think of the plateau in darkness. Think of the pyramid holding its silence like a calm hand. Think of the wind moving gently around it, never stopping, never solving, simply continuing. Think of all the people across thousands of years who looked at that shape and felt the same mixture of awe and confusion you might feel. Think of how that feeling has been passed down, not through bloodlines or archives, but through the sheer, stubborn fact of the monument's existence. This is how Earth remembers, not always with clarity, but with persistence. And this is how we remember, not always with answers, but with wonder. I am Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, and this is where we leave the story. Not closed, not completed, but resting. Like the desert at night, holding its secrets without fear. The Great Pyramid remains what it has always been. A bridge between worlds, a hinge in history, an invitation written in stone. Who built it? Why did they build it? Who came before? The desert doesn't answer, but it listens. And in that listening, somewhere beneath the sand and inside our own quiet minds, the next question is already forming, waiting for another night, another breath, another moment when curiosity returns and finds its way back to the same ancient silhouette against the stars.